Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Edelgard of the Rebellion in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 41, Die for You. I would die for her. I have no doubts about that. And yet I am worried that she cannot change who she is anymore. What the magistrate did to her is unforgivable. And yet I can't seem to find the anger to do anything about it. If Yuri or Balthus were here, they would probably rush in head first and get themselves killed in anger. But me? I'm just apathetic. I don't care anymore. Every day is the same to me. The same old monotony, performing experiment number 4072 on subject number 331. I can't find a reason to live besides her. I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is about to happen. I know my family is superstitious, and they would always say that if you dropped 4 different things on accident in one day it was a bad omen. Well, I dropped 5 beakers today, and one of them caught on fire. I think it's a bad sign, right? I just hope that for once in my life they're wrong. Mom was always right. I hope they've stopped looking for me. I wonder how long it'll be until I finally go insane. I caught myself talking to the mirror the other day. And my mood swings are getting worse. How long will it be until I end up like her? I used to think I would do fine in the underground after living in Abyss, but now I wonder if I'll ever see the stars again. From the Diaries of Happy Albus. Edelgard did not react well to being in confined spaces. She had often dreamed of the walls in her cell, grey with small patches of crimson unable to be buffed out of the stone. There were many nights where they began closing in on her, slabs of concrete and rock threatening to crush her until nothing was left. She could vividly recall the sensation of her ribcage shattering from pressure, her screams vanishing into the ether as the walls threatened to touch. The feeling of suffocation would not leave her for quite a long time, even after she woke in a cold sweat and screamed. It was a similar sensation to what she was feeling now, trapped in darkness. At least she was not being actively crushed in the moment. Edelgard could not tell if it was a brief respite or an end to her torment, though either way it provided her the opportunity to escape. The jagged pains in her chest told her that she had been wounded, perhaps several ribs broken. Though she willed her limbs to move, they would not respond. One step at a time. Just as Pa had taught her. The first to move were her fingers, and Edelgard clenched and unclenched her hands into fists. Then she tried moving her toes, wiggling each one inside the confines of her plated boots. And then she found the problem as she tried to move her arms. Her entire body was encased in a prison of steel. She chided herself for not realizing earlier. Of course, the last thing she remembered was Constance von Novelli trapping her, binding her with chains of scrap metal and concrete, until Edelgard was brought to her knees. That was how she had ended up here. There was a small bit of space between the scrap and her body, but having a few inches of wiggle room did not bring her much comfort. Dimly she could hear muffled talking from outside, but her ears were ringing far too much for her to understand. As her vision began to return, she could see the dark edges of scrap that encased her body. Her helmet had been severely damaged by Constance, jagged cracks ran up and down, and the readouts were too damaged to make sense of. The only light that illuminated her sight was the dim blinking of green and red from her visor. Edelgard had to escape. With all the fury she could muster, she willed her limbs to move once more. She tapped into a reserve of energy fueled by rage as she desperately tried to push her coffin open. Metal and rock groaned as she pushed and pushed, yet she still remained trapped. Still, it was bending the more she exerted herself, which meant that it was very possible to break through. She roared with effort, finding her voice as she managed to push what seemed like an insurmountable weight off of her. This revealed a small crack, letting the light of day through. Though it was tiny, the tantalizing allure of freedom gave her the will she needed to break through. With an earth-shattering crash, the scrap metal around her upper body hit the ground. It was no longer being bound together by Constance's tensors, and so she was able to shove the debris out of her way around her chest. But the rest of her body remained trapped, and though her legs were able to move a fair bit, she would not be able to escape until she cleared out the rest of her metal prison. One of her arms was able to poke out and begin to clear the debris around her legs, but she was merely a torso poking out of a junkyard. It only then occurred to her that she had been trapped within several tons of metal and concrete. Edelgard's prison had been a massive amalgamation of scaffolding, chunks of the floor, and bits and pieces of the auditorium. And despite her best efforts as she pushed with her legs and tried to toss away stray pieces of rebar and steel, her legs remained firmly stuck beneath the weight of her prison. Of course, there was the issue of her injuries. Her ragged breathing and the numbness in her limbs told her that she was injured severely, though the adrenaline in her veins kept her moving. But until the communicator in Edelgard's suit was repaired once more, she could not know the full extent of her injuries. Her visor was cracked, revealing bits and pieces of the world unfiltered through the red glass, but its structural integrity held. Her eyes instantly flicked to the stage, recalling that her fight with the Novelli girl was unfinished. Rage boiled in her veins, remembering the bitter taste of defeat as she was brought to her knees before Constance von Novelli's technology. But she was talking? The whirling debris around her had subsided, or at least it seemed so, considering Edelgard's vision remained blurry. She could not hear the conversation, but as the ringing in her ears began to subside, she began to get a better understanding of what was going on. Yuri Leclerc stood a dozen feet to her left, and she had never seen him as animated as he was now. His piercing purple eyes flickered to meet hers with an expression of surprise and confusion, before returning back to the subject at hand. She could not read lips, but she had a pretty good idea of what he was talking about, considering his sword hand rested on the pommel of his blade. Balthus was positioned slightly to his side, eyes flickering back and forth between the conversation and the entrance to the auditorium. There was anger in his expression, the same one that he had when Edelgard nearly choked out Yuri. But it wasn't rage, perhaps it might have been described as indignance or frustration. The laid-back attitude that the man was normally known for had vanished. She could not read Constance at all. But from her red eyes and constantly changing expressions, their conversation was probably not going very well. Help. From any of you. Constance, look at yourself. You're not doing yourself any favors by being here. I will not be lectured by the man who abandoned me. That's not true. You forgot about me? Her voice cracked with despair, the kind that came only from a feeling of longing and abandonment. Edelgard knew those feelings all too well. How could you, Yuri? How could you? Again, that's Edelgard's first instinct was to run over to Yuri and reach for her weapon. But the more she struggled, the more that the weight of the scrap pressed down on her lower body, preventing her from wriggling her way out. I should kill you where you stand, Constance whispered. Go, and never return. Over my dead body, retorted Yuri. I'm not leaving without you. Poor choice of words, she crooned. Within seconds, tendrils of iron and rebar twisted around the arms of Yuri, wrapping around his torso and pinning him to the floor. He shouted in defiance, but was unable to shake them off as his sword clattered to the ground. Balthus moved to intercept, but with a wave of her hands more debris wrapped itself around Balthus and forced him to his knees. The more he yelled, the more he was imprisoned, until he knelt onto the ground with makeshift chains holding his limbs firmly in place. The swirl of green energy around her fingers dissipated once she was done erecting her makeshift prison. I'm sorry, she said softly. But I can't allow you to leave. Edelgard strained her body, but it was a futile effort. She watched as the last of the Novelles glided out of the auditorium, her feet hovering just an inch above the ground beneath her dress. And no matter how much Yuri cursed and screamed, she did not even turn to look at the three prisoners trapped within their restraints. Her form grew more and more distant, until Edelgard was no longer able to see her in the darkness that loomed beyond the room. If only, Yuri muttered. If only I Save it, she retorted, glaring daggers at her companion. You can wallow in your own regret later. First, we need to get out of here. Can you move your legs? Balthus asked. A feeble attempt at a kick told her otherwise. Not yet, Edelgard replied. Targets moving toward you, she radioed Berlin. Do not engage. Any minute now, Shay. Berlin ducked under a sword strike and countered with a wide swing of her great axe. This was quite easily caught by the second assailant's mace, which threatened to rupture every one of her organs if it connected. The small protruding device on the top of the mace's body signaled that it was a gravity weapon. The physical power of each swing could be amplified by the redirection of gravitational force. Only the magistrate had access to this kind of technology, and it was not something Berlin was looking forward to seeing firsthand. On it. Her subordinate yelled back. The man known only as Shay dashed forward under the assassin's guard, whirling his dual swords around in a circle. They left streaks of purple energy as he relentlessly slashed and slashed at his opponent's guard. It only took one missed block for Shay's left blade to strike true, and the sickening squelch of a vibraz word through flesh could be heard throughout the room. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of Berling's head. Her helmet was scratched and dented in more places than one, and the fatigue was beginning to get to her as she felt a dull ache in her bones. No matter how much the mercenary leader pushed her body, she was still human and she could not keep this up forever. Her opponent was a large surly man clad from head to toe in black armor. Like the rest of the assassins sent to dispatch Berling and Leclerc's mercenaries, they were quick and brutally efficient with their strikes. Even the bulky man she faced fought with the speed of a man half his size, though he was covered in dark armored plates and servos he could match Berling's agility. It was all she could do to match blows with him and her armor was far too light to take a blow. Berling, captain of her mercenaries, would have to end things here and now if she was to survive. But how could she force her opponent to yield? She dodged out of the way of a massive strike from the man's mace, leaving a jagged fissure in the floor tiles where it had struck. Using the window of opportunity from his missed attack, Berling closed the distance and brought her great axe forward in a wide sideways swing. Her opponent dodged with ease. He was bulky, but it did not mean he was slow. However, he failed to account for the second part of Berling's attack, a sweeping attack with her legs as he strained to lift his mace, the metal toe of her boot slamming into his right shin. The assassin roared with anger and retaliated with a frenzied series of strikes. One of them brushed her shoulder, which was enough to make her arm flare in pain. But she gritted her teeth and swatted the rest of the strikes away with her own heated great axe. By batting his gravity mace aside and away from the front of his body, it left him wide open for a strike. Berling lunged forward with all the speed she could muster in an outstretched fist, landing a solid blow square in his chest. No ribs cracked due to the force dissipation properties of his armor and her own knuckles smarted as a result of the punch, but it was a solid hit that would have taken the wind out of anybody. The man grunted, his weapon clattering to the floor as he went along with it. Now he was on his back, sprawled out on the bloodied tiles with his weapon a few inches out of his reach. It was over. Berling did not have the courtesy to let him say his final words. She brought down her great axe onto his head and watched as the metal that surrounded his head crumpled into a jagged V-shape. Blood trickled out of what was left of his upper body, and what remained of his body fell to the floor unceremoniously. She whirled around to see Shay take out two assailants at the same time by skewering them through the base of their skulls. She whistled as he ripped his blades out of their broken bodies. "Is that all of them?" he asked, his knee atop a bloodied and bruised body as he turned off his vibraz words. "In this corridor, yes," replied Lysithea's voice, marred with static. The operator remained unfazed by the carnage, which was certainly a property she admired. "But your men are being overrun in the F and G corridors. They're jamming the channel my mercenaries use," Berling growled. "What's our current fighting strength looking like? Maybe 2/3 of optimal output. Quite a few casualties. It's not looking good. Fuck. We should have our men fall back to the choke point," Shay suggested. "Shore up our defenses where we can." Berling raised an eyebrow. "You don't suggest strategy? Why now of all times?" Shay looked perturbed. "I don't know. It just came to my mind. We should fall back, right? And a strong point is better than multiple weak ones. I'm not arguing that you're wrong. I'm just surprised that your brain was on." "Are you sure?" Lysithea asked. "Yes," Berling muttered. "Relay that message to my men. And Leclerc's men, as well. On it." "How many men are they throwing at us?" Shay muttered, following Berling's lead as she moved toward where they had come from. She watched on her augmented vision a small map of the current level, and breathed a small sigh of relief as she watched her purple dots signifying her men retreat toward her location. The hallways branched outwards like a steel tree, but at the root right outside of the auditorium most of them joined together at a single point. From a tactical standpoint it was the right move even if it might have been futile in the long run. "I don't know," she admitted. "I lost count after the 6th. But for a wetwork squad, they're more equipped and well trained even the rumors say. Any word from Leclerc? Or the Queen? Not as far as I know, Berling sighed. But their vitals are fine. Hopefully they can keep the primary target occupied. I've never seen anything like that before, he said incredulously. It was like a hurricane. I was going to say tornado. Hurricane makes more sense. But a tornado's cooler. She rolled her eyes. She knew Shay was dumb, but she never would admit that it could be quite endearing sometimes. You're an idiot. Anyway, are all the preparations made? As far as I know, Shay replied, we've collected enough samples. Lazai's taken the data off of the servers, and we digitized as many hard copies as we could. But I can't for the life of me understand why we planted explosives the way we did. I don't get it either, she muttered. It's as if the Queen wants to cut off our escape route on purpose. But then why would she give us the detonator? Berling stopped in her tracks. Good point. I don't think she's backstabbing us if she's giving us the keys to our own demise. No, I think there's something she hasn't told us. She's not very talkative. No, Berling agreed dryly. She most certainly is not. They continued in silence, Berling leading the way through the eerie hallways. The decaying tiles and flickering lights resembled an abandoned hospital straight out of a horror movie. But Berling could not afford to shrivel up in fear, like when she watched movies in the dark as a child. Fear was the enemy, the all-consuming disease that seeped through the cracks of her conscience and into her thoughts. She could not let it take over. Not after Dada. Not after her skirmishes with the Blade Breakers. Not after Geraldo had died, leaving her with a sorry band of misfits to take care of. And for the longest time, Captain Berling had believed that she was incapable of fear, that her heart was numb. So why was she afraid of the darkness ahead? She heard a crackling from her communicator, broken syllables barely perceptible beneath static noise that made no sense. The signal jamming was even worse now that the magistrate had sent their kill squads to Mount Gaspard, and it only made her more uneasy. She couldn't help but feel as if it was a running, but the message had been lost to the darkness. Suddenly, Shay stopped. His footsteps came to an abrupt halt, leaving the two of them in an awkward silence. What is it? She turned to face him, only to find that his expression was frozen in confusion. Something's wrong, he muttered under his breath. I can feel it. The rendezvous point is just up ahead, she said, gesturing behind her to the darkness that laid ahead. They were certainly not lost, and distantly she could hear a murmuring that she could not quite make out. There was something down there, and she had a pretty good guess of what it was. Your intuition is noted, Shay, Berling added dryly. But we can't just stop here. Suddenly Shay grabbed Berling and slammed her against the side of the hallway into a small recess. As she shouted in surprise, her lieutenant pressed his back into her, crushing her against the wall as he tried to make himself flush with the rest of the wall. She gasped for air as the wind was knocked out of her, struggling to breathe in the tight space. What the foo? A massive pile of debris shot past them, fast enough to make Berling's head spin. She could not make out what exactly was in it, but it had to have been at least a dozen feet in diameter. It bounced off the walls and floor, clattering and grinding with the harsh sound of metal scraping. Whatever it was, it had just missed Berling by no more than a foot, and by extension it had missed Shay by no more than a few millimeters. Don't move, he whispered. She watched silently from above Shay's head as the ghostly visage of Constance von Novelli floated past, leaving streaks of green as she ripped bits and pieces of the walls and floor out and upwards. Where her gravity manipulation had done its work, jagged ceramic edges and frayed metal ends were left behind. Her dress was in tatters, and whatever dignity her original appearance had was now replaced by bleeding mascara and ruined eyeshadow. Only the strange energy rooting on her outerwear remained constant, pulsing with green energy as if they were her veins. The Novelli girl did not even spare the two of them a glance as she hovered past the alcove. The bone-chilling screech of metal scraping on metal continued down the hall where they had come from, and it was only until the sounds became relatively quiet that Shay poked his head out of the alcove and Berling had space to breathe. Holy shit, Shay muttered. Berling socked him in the stomach. It was a half-force punch, not enough to cause permanent damage, but it was enough to make him keel over in pain. What the hell? He shouted. Don't pin people down without permission, she growled. Especially not your captain, of all people. I wasn't pinning you, Shay coughed out, his face red. I just saved your ass. Permission aside, how did you even know? Berling asked. That she was coming, I mean. Even I couldn't tell, and by the time I would have reacted we'd both still be dead dash. I just. Shay grew uncharacteristically quiet. I just got this weird tingling sensation. Berling's eyes widened. But she did not have time to acknowledge the weird prescience that Shay seemed to have, and so she grabbed his wrist and broke out into a run. But rather than follow Constance, she continued running in the direction that she had come from, and where the two of them were originally intended on going. If her hunch was right, and it usually was, then they had to hurry. Why are we running? Shay panted. It's not like she's chasing us. Shay, she spat out. Are you stupid? What? Our target is on the loose. So? She matched pace with Shay to meet his gaze, and narrowed her eyes to make her point. Because it means that the Queen and Leclerc are incapacitated. That's the only way she would have escaped. Okay, so we need to help them, he said between gasps of air. But what if they're dead? Captain Berling kept her gaze focused on the darkness ahead, praying that her subordinate was wrong. She prayed that there was still a chance that they would make it out of here alive, and things would work out in the end. She didn't believe in the goddess's worship at all. But for once in her life she made a silent offering to the powers that be, so that her subordinates would not give their lives for a hopeless cause. If they are, then we're dead no matter what we do, she said flatly. But I'm willing to bet $1,000 that you're wrong. $2,000 and we'll call it even, Captain. She snorted. If only you had $2,000 to bet with. Now let's go. There was a fondness in Happy's heart specifically reserved for animals. Not that she had ever owned a pet, that was a rich woman's hobby, and money was not something she had the luxury to own great amounts of. But in the outskirts of Newfoundland, and eventually the recesses of Abyss, she made do with what little wildlife there was. Spiders, stray cats, the raccoons that had never seen the world outside of a trash bin. They were her friends more so than the other kids her age. They would receive the scraps of food that she managed to scrounge up where she could, and in exchange she received a peace of mind that could only come from giving. These, however, were quite different. Her hand passed over the broken iron bars of empty cells, where the most recent experiments had been stored pending their termination. She still did not understand what had driven Constance to let the most dangerous ones loose. These were the ones that could not be reasoned with. Mindless beasts did not seek companionship, only their own survival, going off base instincts alone. After all, she would know more than anybody. She had created the monsters from the living corpses of the comatose, those who had willingly signed their rights away in the event of their untimely demise. Well, that was at least what the magistrate told her. It was easier to sleep at night if she believed that they had chosen to give what was left of their lives to science, rather than being coerced into doing so by shadowy powers she did not comprehend. Introducing chimeral blood into their system with the catalyst of heaven produced the monsters she had theorized. Cornelia's research had proven to be the final piece in the puzzle. The blood reconstruction theory she had developed in her time with the Ashen Wolves could now be put into practice. There was a chance that Happy could rid the human race of its ailments, extending their lives and warping their genome with the right combination of genetic material and transformation catalysts. But the magistrate did not ask for that. Instead, they asked for the monsters that she made, her failures proving more useful than her successes. She usually could not bear to watch as their bones and muscles twisted, sinew and flesh wrapping around one another in unnatural ways as what was left of their human body warped into something more bestial. The cost of blood reconstruction was the loss of their humanity, a hurdle that could only be accomplished with fully functional subjects. Teenagers were preferred. They were more malleable, but with a greater degree of maturity than children. But she had abjectly refused to do so even when her own life was threatened, and her minders had not bothered to push the issue further. Happy continued to walk through the empty halls, her footsteps ringing in the darkness. Yuri's men had not found the vast bulk of the specimens, or what was left of their cages. That was only accessible through a special airlocked passage that appeared to be an ordinary wall, and searching for hidden passages was most likely not at the top of their priority list. No doubt they would have been equal parts angry and horrified at the crimes against humanity down here, and it pained her to admit that she was the culprit. But what was done, and any shred of remorse she had was buried underneath a silent acceptance of her own guilt. She had a few guesses for what the magistrate's research division wanted. The most obvious was to create super soldiers stronger and faster than the average man, with the intellect to match. But that came with the risk of individuality. There was always the possibility that they could turn on their masters and fight for a different cause. Monsters were easier to control in that they were uncontrollable. Deployed in the right place, they could wreak havoc with their impenetrable carapaces and inhuman strength. But in the long run, a man was more reliable. The more sinister possibility was that they wanted the human race to evolve past its limits and morph into something new. The science of blood reconstruction was less of a science and more of trial and error. The mutations induced were anything but predictable. But her work on cataloging the chemical composition of a heaven mixture along with the probability of certain mutations had gone a long way towards advancing the augmentation process. She may have made monsters, but she feared that her work was being used elsewhere. Like Coco, she thought bitterly. They had experimented on her in an attempt to produce the mutation they wanted. Her bloodline was valuable, the magistrate scientists had told her. She still did not understand why. But they had created the most dangerous monster of all. Constance von Novelli's intellect, left unchecked and magnified tenfold. It had only come at the small price of her sanity. Happy heard a mewing from one of the cells. She whirled around and peered through the bars to see a tiger-like creature curled up in a dark corner. From the shadow she could see its matted orange fur and black stripes, along with razor-sharp talons that belonged on a bird. Its skull was narrow and reptilian, save for the distinct facial features of a large cat. A chimera of different animals. The random mutations induced by heaven had no rhyme or reason. But now, after years of research, she could steer it in a certain direction. Her monsters would not wither into husks and mounds of flesh like the average heaven addict. She leaned down to see that the bars were bent in the middle, large enough for anybody to step through. But the beast had not left its prison yet, mewing as if it were a tabby cat searching for the warmth of its mother. Happy would have almost felt pity for it, if it had not been a monster of her own creation. With a careful step, she slipped into the space between the bars and reached over to pet its neck. It was a suicidal move for anybody else, but for some reason the monsters trusted her. Or at least the ones that trusted her did not eat her instantly. Those that were uncontrollable were usually disposed of, or in recent times let loose to roam the facility and eat the magistrate guards. And they had done a good job at that. It had only been a few weeks since Constance had snapped and condemned what was left of the skeleton crew that had guarded them. Did they deserve to die? Maybe no more than Happy did, though. But they all carried a certain amount of respect for Happy. It was nonverbal, only discerned from their body language and the way the beasts carried themselves in her presence. They simply would not touch her. Perhaps they had imprinted on her as a mother of some sorts. Or maybe they sensed that she had created them and would not hurt her as a result. But the magistrate forbade any contact after a few incidents with her guards, and so she did not have the chance to bond with her creations. At any rate, the monster purred, moving its head as if to acknowledge the rub. It dipped its head, satisfied. Her fingers ran through its rough fur, feeling more like steel wool than the soft fur of a large cat. Some of them had kept their humanity and need to be loved, searching for the warmth of other animals and people. Maybe one day she would make them able to keep all of their humanity without needing to resort to using live subjects. But why had the beast before her stayed, despite the bars of its cage being broken? She wondered why for a moment as she stroked its back before coming to the simple conclusion. A caged animal knows no other world than the confines of its cage. All it had ever known was darkness. Why would it yearn to explore the outside of its cage if it had no concept of what outside was? Happy wondered sadly if she was caged as well. If only she had never left her small trailer park, happy with the meager existence of her impoverished family. If only she had never left the abyss to pursue her dreams with Constance, blinded by the tantalizing allure of the Fhurdyad School of Science. And she might have been happy if she had never seen the outside world before coming to this facility, her dreams of freedom quashed with each transfer and move between facilities. "You understand me, don't you?" Happy said quietly as she leaned her head onto the beast's side. It purred contentedly. Not that it could understand her exact words, most of its human faculties had been stripped away long ago. But it understood her intent, and once in a while she even heard a reply in guttural syllables and moans. Something human remained when it came to these monsters, and maybe they weren't fully monsters after all. Yuri was right, she said sadly. And the operator girl, too. I am a coward. I know that. But is it wrong to be tired? To have it up to here with all the violence and the destruction? Can I not die in peace? The beast nuzzled her leg affectionately. I shouldn't let it end like this, though. I don't have dreams of playing rebel like Yuri and the Queen, but maybe there's something to dying free versus living caged. Maybe, just maybe. She absent-mindedly played with the straps on her goggles. And Constance, I don't know if she can be saved. Goddess knows I've been trying to find a cure for her instability, and if I had more time maybe I'd find it. But I don't have time. Happy sighed, and for some reason she felt a pang of terror as if she had done something wrong. That was an odd feeling, as if someone had just walked over her grave. I know. I should talk to her. Maybe I can take out some anger on the magistrate while I'm at it, Happy said to no one in particular. It's the least I can do for Yuri Bird and Bee, right? The beast looked at her with black, beady eyes. What's your name? She tilted her head as if to get a better look. It yawned. But on closer inspection, she watched as it repeated the same exact yawn, except with more of a human enunciation. Was it talking? Yulia, came its baritone reply. Jula, Jula. An idea came to her mind. Julia. The beast snorted, as if to approve. Julia. Will you join me, then? You can see the world outside of this dark and stuffy cell. Wouldn't that be nice? It huffed and then roared, the force of the air pushing Happy's hair backwards. But she remained unfazed as it bared its fangs, before reverting to its resting expression of feline discontent. It'll be fun, she said dryly. Come. She got out of her sitting position and moved towards the exit. Slipping between the twisted bars, she managed to make her way into the hallway before she heard quiet footsteps behind her. Happy whirled around to see the beast named Julia following her, sniffing at the walls and the floor, and once in a while stopping to lick the bloodstains on the sides. I'll take that as a yes. And for the first time in a very long time, Happy smiled. Now come, she said. Let's see we can find a few more friends to join us. You look like shit, pointed out Captain Berlin. Edelgard groaned as she freed her left leg from the last remnants of the rubble. It had been a difficult undertaking to remove the key pieces of debris that had been pinning her legs down, but it only took a few strategic movements for Shay and Berlin to free her. The rest she did herself, leveraging her Herculean strength to send the pile of metal and tile clattering to the floor with a crash. Never mind me, she spat behind gritted teeth. Check on Yuri and Balthus. We're fine, a gruff voice said. The bouncer brushed off the dust on his armor and stood to his full stature, large as he was. Bit bruised and emotionally hurt, though. Yuri cussed up a mild storm as Shay helped him to his feet. That stupid son of a dash. Enough, Edelgard cut him off. We need to go. Do you still have that detonator? Yes. But why give it to me dash? You'll see. She shook her head at the apparent lack of trust between the two women. The rendezvous point is up ahead, she reminded Edelgard. Are you in shape to fight? More or less, Edelgard said dismissively. Most of the power functions and display modules had been restored courtesy of a little ingenuity on Lysithia's part. A readout of her suit told her that she had minor injuries around her upper body and lower extremities. The weight placed on her had damaged both her ribs and parts of her forearm, but it had only been minor fractures, nothing that wouldn't heal in a few minutes. But her joints ached and her limbs felt like death, and the only thing keeping her still upright was the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The bitter taste of disappointment lingered on her lips. Edelgard had been bruised and battered by her opponent, and no matter what she tried, Constance had stymied her attempts every step of the way. She was acutely aware that had she been in more of a vengeful mood, Edelgard would have been crushed to death and no lucky intervention or vibration-inducing devices would save her. But there was one thing Edelgard had that she did not: allies. She was far too world-weary to believe in the power of friendship and camaraderie. It was only a numbers game. How many of her so-called allies was she willing to sacrifice? The answer was simple in her mind: as many as it took to win. It took a few minutes to make the jog through the dilapidated facility hallway toward their rendezvous point. Shay and Berling were winded, and she could see the signs of wear and tear as they supported one another when one wavered in their gait. Balthus was holding up fine, but Yuri simply put one foot in front of the other with a harsh scowl on his face. His facial muscles tensed and his forehead creased from time to time, and she wondered if he was still thinking about the Novelli girl. Was it romantic love, she absent-mindedly thought? Edelgard doubted it, but she also did not have much experience with such things to begin with, considering how her college life had been. But if love meant a deep longing for someone whose emotions were inextricably intertwined, then Edelgard understood all too well. Love drove him familial or romantic. She just wished she had seen that side of Yuri Leclerc sooner. Alpha teams and beta teams engaging the unknown magistrate forces, Lysathea intoned. Primary target is in pursuit and not to be engaged. I don't recall making alpha and beta teams, much less gamma, Edelgard muttered. Thank Berling for that. She shot a withering glance at the captain, who didn't even seem to notice. Casualties. 3 confirmed dead. 6 injured, but still able to move. Soon the field of battle came into view, blurs of motion and arcs of energy lighting up the darkened room. The intersection was circular, with enough space for a small table and some desks. But they had been quickly torn to shreds of ripped metal and wood, jagged chunks scattered across the floor along with the usual smears of crimson blood and black goo. She could spot some of Berling's mercenaries from their distinctive purple armbands, engaging the men in black armor in small groups. She watched a man carrying a blade his height cut through a jet-black pauldron, before taking a heavy blow to the ribs that left him reeling on the ground. Another mercenary picked up the slack to deliver a death blow, driving a vibroblade through the assailant's skull. This had to have been one of Yuri's men, shady characters who fought only for the highest bidder, but still putting their lives on the line to save a stranger. The field of battle produced the strangest of bedfellows. And then, in one of the darkened tunnels, she could just barely make out traces of green light. But it was the sound that caught her attention first, a low buzzing that rumbled her core even as she sprinted to cover the distance and assist. There was the screech of metal scraping on metal, the guttural noise of men screaming along with the clamor of objects crashing into the walls with earth-shattering impacts. Edelgard was unsure whether it was Yuri's men, Berling's mercenaries, or the magistrate kill squads who were the subject of her wrath. But it was something she wanted to avoid until after the kill squads were dealt with, and if Constance took some down in the meantime, then it made her life a hell of a lot easier. Magistrate first, she yelled, grabbing her holox from her side and letting it unfurl until a familiar crimson glow enveloped the hallway once more. Deal with Constance later. There were grunts of approval from behind, and so she pushed on ahead. She vaulted forward with axe outstretched, towards the main cluster of magistrate soldiers who were currently focusing their attention on the mercenaries. Despite her injuries, she broke out into a full-out spring and used the momentum to leap several feet into the air once she was fully within the intersection. It was enough to send her careening toward the soldiers, and so she crashed down with her axe to deliver an earth-shattering shockwave in the center of the soldiers. Those that were smart moved out of the way. Those that were not tried valiantly to skewer her mid-fall or block with their weapons, but she was too fast for them to do anything of real value. Edelgard did admire their courage, though courage did little when faced with a pitiful death. The ground shook as her axe struck the tile, creating a shockwave that knocked several of the soldiers back and clearing enough space for her to land. Edelgard steadied herself once she landed with both legs, before swinging her axe in a full rotation around her. A crimson arc cut through the air as she felt the telltale resistance of a hollow blade cutting through flesh, bisecting one of the soldiers and cleaving through the torsos of a couple more. Soldiers rushed in to fill the void from all sides, but she was confident enough in her own ability to take them one at a time. That was the trick. Force them into an uncomfortable position, so that she could engage them on her own terms and turn an ambush into a series of poorly coordinated duels. It was a good plan that rarely failed her. Sweeping attacks were good for fighting multiple targets, but it left her vulnerable to attacks from her side and rear. To counter this, Edelgard shifted stances from a two-handed grip to a single-handed one. It had the added benefit of giving her more reach but less leverage, along with a free left hand to strike with. Her blade cut through lesser weapons with its heft, and where her blade did not cover her, Edelgard used her gauntlet to redirect strikes and deliver her own if needed. She was out of energy capsules for her hollow shield, which meant that her defensive capabilities were much weaker. Though she cut through the well-trained assassins like a hot knife through butter, she was not invulnerable to damage. Edelgard knew that they would soon form ranks and take her on in a more organized fashion, and even now there were dagger stabs and crossbow bolts that slipped under her guard and into her armor. The fact she was injured certainly did not help. But she was still a whirlwind of flame and fury, dodging a great axe sailing over her head while delivering a catastrophic blow to an attacker's kneecaps. She mildly noticed the impact of a bolt in her left knee as she whirled and smashed her way through her opponents. "Queen," someone yelled out amidst the din of battle. "You're being overrun. Fall back." She snarled, both at the fact that she was being ordered around and the fact that the voice was right. Though she had cut a bloody path through the death squad, she was not gaining ground at all, and now they moved to surround her from all sides once more. "Lysithea, come in," she shouted into her communicator. "Standing by. Order all men to the fallback point. I'll hold them off for now. Edelgard quickly grabbed the handle of an electric spear that was being thrust toward her skull, swinging it along with its user toward a group of men. They scattered like ragdolls as she made a break for it back toward the center of the tunnel intersection. With more space to maneuver, it was easier for her to use her inhuman speed to move around and take fights on her own terms. And tell Berlin to blow the detonator once everyone is out of the intersection. Are you sure? But the evidence, the research, we might want to come back and I don't know how to tell you this, Lysithea, she said softly in spite of the carnage surrounding her. But you won't find the answers you seek here. What do you mean? This isn't the first laboratory I've raided, and it won't be the last. Edelgard winced in pain as a mace glanced off of her shoulder, drawn, enough to fell any other soldier but only enough to make her stumble. You and I know more than anybody else what they're capable of. And I swear to you I will find out, even if it takes the rest of my days. She finished off her attacker with a punch to the groin before cleaving his head in two with a swing of her axe. You and I, huh? I'll hold you to that, Queen of Flames. The line cut, and Edelgard was left with only the chaos of battle for company. She figured that the Ordelia girl was much like her, desperate for answers, searching for the reason why everything had been taken from her. And though the circumstances were certainly different, she figured that a few small glimpses of her past would do wonders to gain the young operator's trust. She felt a little guilty manipulating a fellow victim, but until she could glean more information from Lysithea she could not trust her with more. I am only that which I choose to reveal. Someone had told her that long ago, but she did not recall. In a past life, maybe? Out of the corner of her eye, she watched as Balthus drove his blade gloves into a man half his size, Yuri following up behind with a quick stab to finish him off. It was undeniable they were an effective duo in combat, though Yuri seemed a bit rusty with his sword play. But he was clever, and what he could not pick off with his sword he finished off with the hidden dagger he clutched in his left hand. Berlin was being tended to by one of her men, sporting a nasty gash on her right cheek. The captain was slumped up against the wall with one arm twisted the wrong way, and yet she was still barking orders into her communicator as if nothing had ever happened. She liked Berlin's leadership style sterner than Geralt's, but without the micromanaging that Edelgard did. It was no wonder why her mercenaries were so successful, and as they locked blades and formed ranks to protect their own, she decided that Yuri had gotten his money's worth after all. The soldiers who she had been fighting were now locked in battle with a very angry Shay. Now that was something else. His purple vibroblades danced in the darkness, cutting purple swatches through the air as he fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. He would be a valuable asset to have if only she could poach him from Berling's mercenaries. It was a moot point considering how close Shay and Berling seemed, so she tabled the thought for the moment. In the heat of combat they found themselves with their backs against one another, facing off against the world. As their allies moved toward the exit, limping and supporting one another, Shay and Edelgard remained the only thing standing between them and the magistrate's death squads. "Holding up?" Shay asked nonchalantly. "About as well as you are," she replied as coolly as she could. "Great. I'll finish these guys off and we'll dash." He didn't even have time to finish his sentence before more men rushed in, striking at Shay with whatever they had on hand. Edelgard was in a similar situation. She ducked and weaved through crossed swords and thrust spears, breaking through the line with whatever she had. Their armor was good. Her strikes had to be carefully aimed at the weak points between plates, and they knew not to let themselves get hit in the head by her deadly hollowks. And each time they began to anticipate her movements by blocking off her escape and flanking her where she least expected, she began to improvise more. "Save the small talk for later," she shouted. Shay kicked a woman toward her, who crumpled beneath a massive blow from her axe. "I ordered a retreat, did I not?" "Easier said than done," he yelled back. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a whirring and a low rumble. The ground itself shook, enough to make the hairs on Edelgard's neck stand up on end. There were cries of anguish from the tunnel a few meters away, then silence. "Damn it! She's already finished them off. We're all out of here," Berlin hissed over the communicator. "Where the hell is Shay? She turned to look at the man in question, who was currently locked in battle with a man twice his size. He dodged the man's great axe, only to get caught by an energy bolt in the back. The bolt pierced through his armor, deep enough to leave a scar. Then a second one hit. She did not wait for a third before she moved towards him. To his credit, he did not drop his guard at all. He whirled his blades in a circle, shouting in defiance as he rushed toward the sniper in question. But Edelgard was faster. She managed to grab onto his left hand, which he immediately reacted to by trying to wrench it free and moving his right sword to intercept before he saw who it was. "Wadash! Go!" With all of her might, she grabbed Shay by his shoulder and hurled him across the room toward the tunnel from which they had come from. No doubt she had broken a few ribs in the process, but he managed to land relatively gracefully. Blood dripped from where he had come from. The wounds on his back were deep, and required immediate medical attention. Only adrenaline was keeping him moving, but at least he was moving. He looked back at her, his face a mixture of confusion and anger, before turning back and sauntering through the tunnel. She had no time to check on if he was okay or not. By now she was beginning to slow. Her body was slow to fatigue, but her mind was starting to wander. Strikes that she should have easily dodged landed, shattering parts of her armor as she moved to cover her weaknesses. And though the onslaught of soldiers now slowed to about a dozen at most, these remained highly trained fighters who would not hesitate to kill her if given the opportunity. How many had she killed? Dozens? She was beginning to lose count. But Edelgard had a sneaking suspicion that they were not there for her. "Out!" a voice roared. A wave of force passed over Edelgard, forcing her to her knees. Those next to her were not so lucky. They crumpled to the ground, before skewers of metal and rock erupted from the ground, sending men flying or impaling them outright. She barely managed to roll away from a jagged shard of metal headed right toward her abdomen, before a rain of smaller projectiles began shooting toward her. Constance. Her dress was in tatters, revealing hints of her bloodied skin underneath. The once perfectly curled blonde hair she had been so proud of as a child was singed and charred at the edges, covered in dust and gore. And worst of all, beneath her once elegant features she now sported a wicked grin. "Blow the detonator," she yelled into her suit. "But what about you?" Berling's shaky voice replied back. Why was Berling hesitating? Edelgard had judged her a woman of actions, rather than careful thinking and planning. Or maybe it was misguided sentimentality on the captain's part that she could not afford to blow Edelgard to smithereens to achieve victory. That was a poor quality in a leader. Though it was admirable in a person, it would not keep her alive to see the fruits of her so-called morality. "Do it now, Helena," she growled, using the captain's first name. "Else you'll never see the light of day again." She made a run for it toward where she had come from, and just as she felt Constance rip the ground up from underneath her, all hell broke loose. Edelgard's gamble had paid off. Berling and her mercenaries had followed her instructions to the letter. Lay a series of explosives on the walls of the intersection and its supporting columns so that the whole hallway would come down when the detonator was blown. It would ensure their escape, considering it would take days to dig through all the rubble. However, it also doubled as a way to crush her enemies if need be. And yet she had given the detonator to Berling. Edelgard saw it as a test, a way to judge Berling's loyalty, and a way to instill trust in someone who she had barely met. Of course, she didn't mention that the detonator could be remotely deactivated at any time. She was very particular about those that she could trust. Clearly Captain Berling had passed her test of loyalty. But it was a moot point, considering Edelgard might not live to see her plan come to fruition. The last thing saw before she closed her eyes was the look of surprise etched on Constance's features, the earth crashing down and plunging the two of them into darkness once more. She heard a voice call out to her. "El. El. It's not your time yet." The voice was oddly beautiful. Raspy, and yet there was a touch of softness to it. But it was a voice she knew intimately. Her heart burst and shattered into a million pieces as she tried to place it in her mind, but could not. She wanted to reach out and take the voice's hand, but she found nothing but darkness. "Get up, El. Get up and fight." She regained consciousness mid-stride just in time for a large mass of fur to slam into her, knocking the wind out of her sails. Whatever had hit her crashed to the ground with Edelgard in tow, as the ground continued to shake. What in Alel? Something pushed off of her, and her vision unblurred just in time to see some sort of creature whimper and shake bits of dirt off of its matted fur. Its orange fur reminded her almost of a tiger, and yet something about it seemed off. Then she remembered where she was, and she raised her weapon. "Easy now," an exasperated voice said. "Julia just saved your ass. Care for a thank you?" The beast quickly sprinted over to its owner, who finally came out of the shadows and into the light. Of all the people she expected to save her, Happy was probably near the bottom of the list. Her goggles were cracked and she sported a few scratches on her cheek, but she remained just as nonchalant as ever in her floppy lab coat that was now covered in soot and grime. Despite all of that, her expression caught Edelgard's attention, sad and wistful, as if she was regretting what she had just done. "What?" she croaked out. "Figures," she grumbled. "I guess you're mad that I came too late to fight, but just in time to save your life." She brushed away a stray lock of red hair that caught on her lips. She was at a loss for words. "Thank you." A few more monsters moved to Happy's side, a snake-like creature with avian features curling around her leg and another that seemed like a cross between an owl and a bear perched on her shoulder. Those were monsters, Edelgard thought. How had she even managed to pacify them, much less tame them? Something was off. She had been caught in the explosion just a minute ago, and Edelgard had been willing to embrace death, if not debilitating injury. So how had Happy just managed to save her from the falling rubble? It was as if time had rewound just a few seconds. Edelgard stood up and nearly keeled over. She steadied herself with the wall as Happy extended a hand. She glared at the woman through her cracked visor before taking it. "I finally decided, you know. I do want to leave. And Constance." She remained quiet for a second and looked at the rebel. "I didn't want to admit it. That maybe she was beyond saving, that maybe I was wasting my time down here. I couldn't make that choice myself. But I guess you made it for me, now that you brought down half the facility. Is she dead?" She sucked in a fair bit of air. "Nope." Edelgard whipped around and noticed that a fair bit of the rebel was hovering. She swore loudly and yelled for Happy to run, only to be met with a sad shake of her head. A figure burst from the rubble, shooting towards them with tendrils of green light in an explosion of dust and gravel. Constance von Novelli landed gingerly on her feet, now covered in a layer of gray from head to toe. Somehow she was unharmed. No doubt it had been due to her tensors pushing away the fallen rubble from her body. Edelgard would have been impressed were it not for the fact that her plan had failed. "You fucked up my dress," she screeched. "You'll die for that." "Coco," Happy said quietly. "My dear Happy," Constance said through gritted teeth, her eyes flickering toward her friend. "What are you doing outside of the lab?" "It's over, Coco. We should go." "You're betraying me, Happy? After all we've been through? After this woman destroyed everything I care about? I'll kill her. She was just trying to save you." "And what good did that do?" she roared in response. "Now I have nothing. Not even you." "You still have me," Happy whispered. "I'll always be here for you." "Then why are you helping her? You've got it all wrong." She shook her head sadly. "We should have run away a long time ago. But we spent our days wasting away, slaving for the magistrate, and now we have nothing left." "I had you," Constance said bitterly. "But now you've gone and turned against me. Just like Yuri and Balthus. You're all a bunch of filthy traitors." The expression of hurt on Happy's face was indescribable. "This isn't working," Edelgard said. "We need to dash." She raised her hand. "Julia." A wall of fur slammed into Edelgard once more, hard enough to knock her down and crack something. She was about to kick and scream until the beast was off her, but she found that it was merely pinning her down with its weight. It sat on top of her breastplate, pushing her downward, and despite her augmented strength, Edelgard found that she no longer had the will to fight. Her hallocks clattered to the ground a few feet away, before sputtering out as the red energy dissipated and faded to nothingness. "I'm sorry, Coco. But it was going to happen eventually. Do you think the magistrate would just sit there once you killed our escorts? They were coming for us. It was just a matter of when." "I don't care," she screamed. This place is all I have left of my family. Of House Novelli. And now it's been destroyed." She pointed a bony finger at Edelgard, still pinned to the floor. "By her. Look what the magistrate's done to you." Happy shouted uncharacteristically. "You've become impossible. You can't just blame everything on a stranger who barely understands." "I barely understand. What else can I do?" "Leave," she said quietly. "We can leave all of this behind. Start a new life. Change our names, our faces, whatever it takes to get away from all this madness." "I can't leave," Constance muttered. "I knew that from the moment the magistrate cut me open on the table. It's just not a possibility. Please, Coco. You'll die here. I don't care whether or not I live or die." "Then live for me," she pleaded. "I can't bear to leave you here alone." "The only thing I care about now," Constance growled, "is killing everything that stands in my way. Starting with her." Her eyes glared daggers down at Edelgard's broken body, and she flinched. "You don't have to. Just walk away," Happy said softly. "She has to pay. The magistrate has to pay. Not her. They're all the same to me." A makeshift spear of steel materialized around Constance, created from broken pieces of scaffolding and structural implements ripped from the ground. It hovered above her head and now pointed toward Edelgard. This was all it took for Edelgard to push the creature off of her and scramble to her feet, legs and limbs creaking as she struggled to maintain her balance. "Don't do this, Coco," Happy said, one hand raised in an open palm as she moved closer toward Edelgard and Constance. The other hand was awkwardly placed in one of the pockets in her lab coat. "Get out of my way," Constance growled through gritted teeth. "I'm not your enemy," Edelgard interjected, raising her hands in mock surrender. But her eyes flickered back and forth between the hallocks on the floor and the woman before her. Constance clawed and scratched at her face in anguish. "I'm not." Stop it. "No more. Stop talking." Edelgard felt herself forced to the ground, and she realized with horror that her vibration inducer on her breastplate was no more than a tatter of wires and circuitry. She no longer had any defense against Constance's tensors, and it would kill her. "Constance, no!" Happy screamed, and she shot forward. The spear came down towards Edelgard, and she braced for impact. But it never came. Blood sprayed onto her visor as she realized with horror what had just happened. Happy stood a few feet in front of her, clutching the spear that had just impaled her through her abdomen and through her lab coat. She fell to the ground, and with a massive crash everything Constance had been holding up with her powers fell to the ground. "Happy," she shrieked. Constance rushed over to her side, and it was then that Edelgard realized that she was no longer being bound by the tensors. But she was still too shocked to move as Constance knelt down and wrapped her arms around the broken form of Happy. She tried desperately to stop the bleeding, pressing her gloves to the wound and trying to pull it out, but it only made things worse. "What?" Constance whispered between sobs. "What have I done?" Her cheeks glistened with tears as she held onto her companion tightly. "I'm sorry, Happy. I'm sorry. Then she collapsed as well, as Edelgard saw the small form of a syringe embedded in Constance's neck. Happy was holding it, her fingers shaking as she pushed the plunger all the way down. The two of them held each other in an embrace, neither of them moving. "Why, Happy?" Constance barely managed to get out. "It was the only way," she croaked out in response. I had to save you, even if it meant dying for you. That had been her plan all along. If reason failed, then Happy would gamble her own life in order to restore the Novelli girl to her senses, even if that meant sedating her. Edelgard could only watch as the two held each other, despite their strength waning with every passing second. "Don't leave me." Her voice began to fail her as her eyes desperately tried to remain open. But they closed sooner than later, and the expression of anguish Constance wore now relaxed as if she was asleep. Edelgard should have been relieved, but she only felt her stomach churn in anguish. "I love you, Coco," Happy said, cupping her cheek. "If only it didn't have to end like this." "Medic!" Edelgard screamed into her communicator. But all the comm links were down, so she settled for screaming it as loud as she could. "We need a medic here. Please." "There's no point," she said quietly. "I know when a wound is fatal." "But dash." "Queen," she said quietly. "The information you want is in my diary. Let Eurybird and B read it first." "But why?" Edelgard rasped out. "You could have waited until after I died. Why take the spear for me?" "Because," Happy whispered. "I've never sacrificed anything for anyone before. I wanted to see what it was like." "Sacrifice." The words rang hollow in her numb ears. "I will avenge you," she growled. "I swear it in the name of the goddess." "There's no need for that," she said with a faint smile. "Just make sure Coco is okay. That's all I ask. Grant a dying girl her last wish, will ya?" "You can't die." "I won't let you," she shouted, and now Edelgard scrambled over to help. She reached for her belt and fumbled for a shot of stims, before Happy slapped her hand away. I see the stars, Coco. Aren't they so beautiful?" Happy sighed, and then her eyes closed for the final time. Chapter 42, Fractured Thoughts. There are no traces of Anna's past. Not a single record, not even a hint of family genealogy from the DNA sample we collected. And yet every single person we've spoken to in Abyss has vouched for her and her little secret shop, including me. Why does she garner so much goodwill in a town of cutthroat mercenaries and shady salesmen? She would be a valuable asset for her ability to procure rare weaponry alone, much less the raw materials needed to sustain an operation of this size. But I wonder what she seems to be hiding beneath that cheery disposition of hers. Secrets, perhaps. A sordid past? Something she is fleeing from. I am asking you to find out for me, by any means necessary. If you can dig into her past and uncover whatever motive she has beyond material gain for joining us, then I would be more than pleased. If there is anyone that can do it, it is you. But do be careful, Flesh. Your position is vital to our cause, and I will not have you dying on me. Your bonus is attached below. An encrypted communication between Flesh Burgleys and presumably the Queen of Flames. She stood with axe in hand, legs spread shoulder-width apart to steady her stance and keep her movements options open. Standing before her on the field of battle were her three opponents: a brawler, an archer, and a swordswoman. Each of them held their weapons up: gauntlets, a crossbow, and a sword, ready to strike on presumably the brawler's command. Her eyes narrowed as she waited for the command to strike. The first to strike had the mover's advantage. But it did mean that they were very vulnerable to a clever counter-attack, and she was nothing but clever. Raw strength could win the battle in a chaotic melee, but this was a 3-on-1. The only target they had in mind was her, and she was alone on her side of the battlefield. Still, it meant that the odds were overwhelmingly in her favor. The brawler held up his hand in a fist and dashed forward, shooting past his compatriots with blinding speeds as his outstretched fist moved faster than they could keep up with. Edelgard easily dodged his initial strike and retaliated with a kick to his upper chest, which he managed to block by pulling his other arm back toward body. As she turned around, she saw 3 bolts loosed at her chest, which she managed to weave out of the way only in time for the swordswoman to engage. No time to think. Just fight. She locked blades with her opponent, casually swatting away the fighter with a closed fist toward his torso. She was tempted to use her strength to crush her enemy, to destroy their weapon and them in one fell swoop. But for the sake of her pride, she held back. Edelgard von Hresvelg tried her damnedest to focus on the battle ahead of her. But her mind began to wander to her past, to all too fresh wounds that had not even been given the proper time to heal. And as she clashed over and over again, she remembered the sting of failure burning away at the back of her mind from a few weeks ago. Yuri, in his blazing anguish, surprisingly did not blame the Queen of Flames as she had predicted. He only asked for time for him and Balthus to grieve. One held the broken body of Happy Albaz, the surname of which had been engraved on her diary, her eyelids shut in a peaceful smile in spite of her fatal injury. The other held the slumbering body of Constance von Novelli, hypodermic needle still embedded in her bloody neck as she twitched. Berlin had removed the tensors by way of force, and it was a miracle that she had not taken Constance's fingers along with it. The damage to her hands remained significant, since it seemed much of the circuitry had been grafted into her flesh. But she was still alive, and she was unsure if Yuri was happy or angry about that. The Queen of Flames remained stoic as ever, adamant that Happy had died a hero fighting the enemy. As for Edelgard, well, she had not revealed the part where Happy sacrificed her life for a complete stranger. All they had to know was that the Ashen Wolf had made the greatest sacrifice for the sake of stopping Constance. And who were any of them to deny Happy's resolve? Edelgard played the role of the Queen perfectly. But on the inside, her mind was in complete anguish. She could not comprehend giving her own life for something beyond revenge for the simple sake of altruism. Happy had died to save another. There was no special bond, no hidden message, no destiny to fulfill. It did not make sense at all. Time slowed as the sword came inches from her face. She saw the path she had to take to dodge. A quick sidestep would work. A bob of her head would cause the strike to miss. Hell, even a timed counter-attack would suffice and perhaps do more damage to her assailant. But she was too busy trapped in her own thoughts, thinking about things that had already transpired. Only her reflexes saved her. Her body moved on its own, jerking her head backward in an awkward manner and forcing her to sweep her axe to clear some space. She barely even noticed the volley of bolts heading toward her, which she managed to block with the well-timed activation of her shield. They buried her in a shallow grave in the tunnels of Abyss. It was lucky that they managed to find the exit. Even the map of the facility that Lysithea had scrounged up from the magistrate's records did not have any trace of a passage. But one of Berling's men, who had been a miner many years prior, recognized the telltale fracturing of laser-drilled rock in the rubble of the auditorium. It only took a few explosives to reveal the waste disposal chute that ran through from the laboratory to the tunnels underneath, and Edelgard used her grappling hook to bring them down 2 by 2. No one asked any questions about what they were disposing of. The ash that she could smell through her filtered helmet told her exactly what it was, and so she remained silent. The Queen of Flames was stoic, unwavering in the face of a nightmare. The girl beneath was not, and she struggled to suppress a shiver each time she descended into the darkness. The last time, she carried down Yuri along with the body of Happy, cradled gently in his arms as if she had been his beloved. Once they were out of the chute and into the tunnels, he reached for a spear and began to dig, barely a handful of dirt at a time. When she motioned to help, Balthus waved her back. They would do it. And so they dug with their poor substitutes for spades, bit by bit until the grave was deep enough to lower her in. And once more, the spears hit the dirt until Happy vanished into the earth as if she had never been there. Edelgard stood there in a stupor until Yuri tapped her on the shoulder. "Queen," he said. "You were there when she took her last breath. Do you have any words to give?" She had missed the eulogies of Yuri and Balthus, but no doubt they were private and not meant for her ears. She looked at him for a moment before nodding silently. Edelgard von Hresvelg knelt before the grave of a woman she did not know. She thought for a few seconds of all the words left unsaid, all the emotions in her heart for a stranger that should not have stirred her heart so. "I did not know you, Happy," she thought. "We were not family. We were not even friends. And yet you gave your life to save me, to save Constance so that she could be stopped. If not you, then it would have been somebody else that died by her hand. But you chose your own death, and in that death I hope you found the meaning we all strive for in life should we all be so lucky. I cannot blame the Novelli scion for your death. It was by her hand, yes, but it was the magistrate that drove you to your brink, that caged you like dogs. I will not pledge my vengeance in your name, but I swear to you that your death will not be in vain. What happened to Constance, what happened to Lysithea, to me it will never happen again. That I swear, if not on the goddess then on my name as a Hresvelg. The silence lingered for a little longer before she spoke out loud. Happy. Thank you. May you find the peace in death that you wished for in life. Her brevity said more than 1,000 words could. Or so she hoped. Then she walked back into the darkness. The first order of business was to deal with the sniper. She managed this by setting a clever trap. She left her flank unguarded, focusing her attention on the sword woman. The brawler would not hesitate to charge at her foolishly, and the archer would continue to fire bolts hoping that one of them would hit its mark. Her head remained fixed forward, but her eyes flickered to her left and right, hoping to catch a glimpse of her opponents from a side view. Edelgard was acutely aware that she was being backed into a corner. And as the woman thrust her sword toward Edelgard's chest, and the brawler plunged his fist toward the back of her head, she quickly dodged out of the way before pivoting backwards with inhuman speed. Without even using her axe, she kicked the fighter square in his chest. He grunted in pain as he careened backwards, tumbling to the ground and into the archer, who yelped in surprise. One of the bolts glanced off of her shoulder, but she paid it no attention as she reared back around only to catch a sword strike with her axe. She's a risk, Lady Edelgard. If we do not secure her dash. I was asking you, but now I am ordering you. Do not mention her in our report. Hubert tapped his finger to his head. This is your heart speaking over your mind. We cannot afford to have our plans unraveled because of your sympathy towards a dash. Monster. Edelgard's temper flared, her face contorting with anger. Is that what you were going to call her? Her retainer sighed unabashedly. I was intending to use the term anomaly. I don't care what you're calling her. Her curse is our allies' doing, I know it. It reeks of his handiwork. Not quite, he corrected her. It reeks of their handiwork. I have never seen a curse so potent, and yet absolutely undetectable until she sighs. It's almost impressive, were it not for the fact that she poses a grave threat to both the Abyss and us. If the Ashen Wolves can keep her in check, then it won't be a problem. Until then, I suggest keeping your mouth shut, Hubert, she sneered. Ah. You wish to keep her as a weapon of our own? No. I doubt that. For once, Hubert, she sighed rather quietly. I'm thinking with my conscience rather than my brain. If we let Thales dash. Do not speak his name, he hissed. You do not know who might be listening in. My uncle, she spat out. If he finds out, then she's as good as dead. No doubt he will be happy to recapture her or cut her open and find how to replicate the curse. Neither are fates that the girl deserves. And if he does find out, even if we don't tell him. Her face was a mask of grim determination. He won't. Hubert shook his head, and then moved to his desk. With a wave of his hand, documents appeared that had not been there just a moment prior. The dark magics the mages had taught him had come in handy outside of combat. She doubted any of the knights would be able to unravel the deceptively complex spell used to hide the reports sent to her from her so-called allies. She had sifted through them relatively quickly, though all of them made the knot in her stomach grow even larger. Whatever they're doing at Remire, it will have adverse effects that will ripple throughout Fodlan, he declared. I suggest we focus on that rather than the finer details of what we report to your uncle. What is there to focus on? We cannot stop Solon and his ilk. Stop, perhaps not. But redirect them toward a different path, one that will minimize the amount of casualties dash. And you were the one chastising me for having a bleeding heart. I dislike wanton bloodshed as much as you, Lady Edelgard, Hubert admitted. It is a far more effective strategy to gain the hearts and hopes of the people by saving them. Hubert, must you always be so calculating about everything? Edelgard said, exasperated. It's fine if you admit that you have a soft spot for people. I do not believe in saving every life, he continued. But a living body can take up arms in your name. A corpse cannot. She snorted, before a groggy voice outside the door startled her halfway to death. Edelgard. Hubert. Sleep. Now. The two of them locked eyes and did not move an inch. How did she dash? Edelgard whispered, her eyes bulging in surprise. The professor is awfully astute. A hint of a blush formed on her cheeks, and she hoped that in the darkness Hubert could not see lest he pester about it for the next month. Random chance, Hubert muttered back. She could not have heard our conversation through the walls, much less my presence which I have so carefully concealed. If you don't go to sleep, the professor said once more. I'll personally assign the two of you to stable duty along with Ferdinand. They locked eyes once more, Hubert's face surprisingly wide with panic. Sleep. Sleep. In the blink of an eye, Hubert vanished in a beam of purple, and Edelgard was left wondering how in the name of the goddess had her teacher noticed their late-night conversations. Did she suspect Edelgard of being? No. She had covered her tracks well. But an illicit liaison in the night, well, that was a far better explanation for why two students were up so late, and even though Hubert did not have a romantic bone in his body, it was the only explanation, and surely the professor would jump to such a conclusion since she was so smart, and she would judge Edelgard for it, and then her dreams would be ruined. Edelgard buried her face in her pillow, cheeks burning. The archer and the brawler laid in a heap on the floor. Now for the swordswoman. Her opponent was at an advantage due to the weapon matchup, and her sword play kept Edelgard from delivering a crucial blow. Several times their blades clashed, and she resisted the urge to simply overpower her opponent with brute strength. That was not necessary here. In order for Edelgard to be satisfied, she would win through skill alone. The swirling and slashing style of the swordswoman made it difficult to land a blow. By the time Edelgard brought her axe down, already the blade was back into guard position and ready to strike once more. If there was something besides her form to praise, it was the fact that her opponent remained upright with no hints of dizziness despite her constant spinning maneuvers. She would slash, and then block, and then whirl around and deliver a strike toward Edelgard's arms, and then slash again in a fluid motion. However, it was easy to find a flaw in her sword play. Her opponent was too flashy, focused on fluidity and moving from one attack to the next, without taking the time to deliver a crippling blow. It would work on weaker opponents, but a trained duelist only needed to catch her off guard once. Unfortunately for the swordswoman, Edelgard had seen her fair share of style over substance in her dueling days. All it took was a single misstep, and then. Are your injuries healing fine? Of course. Thank you for asking, Edelgard said with mock gratitude. I hope that you've been holding up well since the last time we spoke. The owner of Leclerc's shook his head, but there was a small smile on his face. Even through the holographic screen she could see bags under his eyes, and perhaps too much red peeking through the white of his sclera. I've made my peace with it. As for the other problem, we managed to put her on ice until we can figure out a way to remove the tensors. They seem to be directly connected to her nervous system. It was bad enough we ripped off the gloves during our escape. Unfortunately, it's too nerdy for me to understand, he sighed. Until we find a solution, she's going to be under guard for a while. Good. You have my sympathies, Edelgard said earnestly. But rest assured I'll be looking into a solution on my end as well. I figured as much. If I find anything, or even a hint of information in the documents we procured, I'll dash. You'll let me know, he finished. I know. Yuri Leclerc waved his hand dismissively. Thanks, Queen of Flames. For what? For joining me. He gulped down his words. It wasn't a success by any means, but I think that Happy would be satisfied knowing at least Constance was out of the hands of the magistrate. I hope so. Things will work out. I'm sure of it. I do hope so. He sighed, and it almost reminded her of someone else and their tendency to sigh in the most inopportune of situations. This won't change my support for your Eagles. Just, give me some time. Of course, she said softly. Next time I'm in Abyss, I'll stop by Leclerc's. We'll drink to her. In her memory. Good. Then when the time comes, I'll see you there, Yuri finished, his expression blank. Goodbye, Queen of Flames. The line cut, and Edelgard was left alone in her study once more as the mask broke. She pressed a button on her right temple to deactivate the face shielding, and she saw her own expression staring back at her in the hollow screen. It was the face of a woman who had seen death, who had gone through hell and survived. It was weariness etched in every nook and cranny of her visage. It was almost reminiscent of an Edelgard that had not been there since the days after her escape from the magistrate. She cradled her head in her hands, averting her eyes from her own reflection. And she would have stayed like that forever, until a ping from her communicator jolted her out of her self-induced stupor. Lysithea. Now it was her turn to sigh. She kneaded her knuckles into her eyeballs to shake off the weariness, and then continued on as if nothing had ever happened. Are we done here? The moans and groans of her opponents lying on the floor served as confirmation. Yes, Caspar muttered. We yield. Edelgard extended a gloved hand toward him, and she pulled her lieutenant to his feet as he struggled to stay upright. Then she did the same for Ash, who was sporting a small bruise on his cheek where Caspar had tumbled into him, and then the last of the bunch. She sized up the prospective recruit. Short, with long reddish hair tied up in a ponytail, a bit on the scrawny end, no more than 25. On the surface she did not seem impressive, but she knew her way around a sword, even if it was more flashy than deadly. Something about her bright expression was familiar. Edelgard had certainly seen her before. The light sparring armor borrowed from the armory suited her, Edelgard judged. And she had lasted longer than Caspar, even if he was holding back in order to test her skills. Though the woman would not be her first pick, she certainly would not be her last either. A name popped into her head from memory. Anna, is it? Why yes. Yes it is. Sole proprietor of Anna's secret shop at your service. Ah. So that's where I know you from. The Queen of Flames has visited my shop. You sell very good wine. It was a hidden bazaar in Abyss, behind one of the alleyways near Mercedes's clinic. Well, it was more of a street cart than anything else. Random knickknacks, supposedly special artifacts, and the occasional weapon or two hung from the sides of the cart, which she moved whenever enforcers came by. She was notorious in Abyss for her ability to resist haggling and for her infectiously bubbly personality. When Edelgard was younger and still recovering from her confinement, she would sneak out and buy wine off the girl for a significant markup. Anna never questioned what the bottles were for, and despite Edelgard's youthful appearance, never questioned her age. That was why Edelgard did not mind the fact that she was being fleeced for all she was worth, and though Anna often asked if she was okay, Edelgard would always try to answer in the affirmative. Her smile was infectious. It was too bad Edelgard had gone as Edelgard and not as the Queen of Flames, and so she did not elaborate more on her visit. I do. Anna chirped. I'm very glad you've stopped by. Now, if dash. Hold it, Caspar interrupted, moving to Edelgard's side. What did you think, Queen? You want Anna's combat evaluation right now? She ready to join up with us yet, or does she need to wait another year or two? She said without moving an inch. He raised an eyebrow. And? Anna, Edelgard asked, ignoring her overeager lieutenant. Why do you want to join the Black Eagles? Well, all of that stuff was on my application and I dash. I know it was, she continued. But I want to hear it from you. Why join a resistance group and not just some mercenary band? You seemed to be doing fine as a merchant. Well, she said. I hate the enforcers. They're always getting in my business, and I can't even sell things without being harassed. I'll fight for anybody that fights them. You're an illegal street vendor, Edelgard replied dryly. Of course they'll harass you. It's none of their business what I sell. And speaking of selling, Anna added. I can get you guys goods at a very cheap price. I'm the whole package. Edelgard rolled her eyes beneath the mask. At least she was honest about having a monetary incentive to join. And where'd the sword play come from? I had to pick up a few tricks from the mercenaries who buy from me. A girl has to defend her shop, and I can't count on other people. So I just stick 'em with the pointy end whenever someone tries to rob me. Caspar laughed. Well, that's one way to protect merchandise. I'm just said that I couldn't beat the Queen of Flames, Anna said mournfully. Imagine if I did, I'd have the best drinking story ever. If you did beat me, Edelgard replied snarkily, you'd be leading the Eagles right now. But you did pretty good. Really? Her eyes lit up like saucers. Pretty good for an amateur. Oh. Anna's expression soured, her eyebrows drooping as she puffed out her cheeks. I'll admit your sword play is pretty good. may be good enough to give Monique a run for her money, but combat is more than flashy tricks without substance. You can dance around all you want with fancy footwork and twirls, but you need to be able to kill. Her gaze locked onto Anna's, studying her expression intently. Can you do that, Anna? Kill another human being? Her expression went blank for a moment. Then she nodded firmly. Yes. Yes, I can. I'll slash them like I slash my prices. Edelgard pressed a hand to her forehead in annoyance. This isn't a bar fight, or a few petty thieves running away with your merchandise. This is a rebellion. Things are going to get bloodier than you can imagine. I won't tolerate hesitation from any of my eagles. I never hesitate, Anna said without missing a beat, and her grin returned once more. It's just not in my nature. Edelgard had her doubts about the girl, especially since her sunny disposition and seeming disregard for the gravity of the situation might get her killed. But as long as she had the motivation to fight, she could not turn away a willing fighter. And, Edelgard thought, I do owe her a debt. A small one, but a debt nonetheless. And a Hresvelg always pays her debts. Then consider this your initiation, the Queen of Flames declared, offering a gauntleted hand out towards Anna. Welcome to the Black Eagles. Really, she squeaked out. Then Anna grabbed her hand enthusiastically and shook, as if they were sealing a backroom deal. Thank you, Queen. I mean, sir. Thank you, sir. There was the sound of cheering and clapping, though it was only mildly enthusiastic. Edelgard turned around to see about a dozen of her soldiers grinning and laughing, and even a few exchanging credits, probably a bet or two on whether or not the girl would make the cut. She remembered that the makeshift training arena they were in, a repurposed storage room big enough to host a small gathering, was open to pretty much everyone. She had been so caught up in the flow of the battle that she had forgotten where she was. Now go meet some of your new comrades, Edelgard said, lightly shoving Anna toward the soldiers that were waiting. And you guys over there treat her well. I won't have a repeat of the cupcake incident ever again. Understood, Queen, someone shouted out. No more cupcakes. Another squeaked out. Anna skipped on over to the exit of the training arena, the door hissing open as the crowd who had been watching moved to leave. Edelgard supposed that once upon a time this had been a storage room for the old metro that ran through Newfoundland, considering the size of the place. The room was mostly bare aside from the concrete flooring, and the occasional training dummy along with a small archery range. It was not the most ideal place for training as a college student. Her training facilities had been nicer, but it was good enough for the Black Eagles. After all, they could not afford military-grade virtual reality training, and Edelgard was not about to dip into her inheritance for that. Queen, Ash said, breaking his silence. He had been awkwardly standing off to the side the entire time, and she was reminded that the boy, no, man he was of majority in spite of his small stature, had nearly zero presence in a room. A good trait for a sniper, but also a bad one when it came to speaking his mind. She has to return the plastic sword. She'll do it later, Edelgard said dismissively. Casper. What's up? Can you put our training weapons away? I'd like to speak to Ash for a moment. Sure thing, boss. She offered the plastic training axe, which was blunted yet still deadly in the right hands, up to Casper, who took it along with the rubber bolts that Ash had been using. He walked off towards the armory, though since the man could not catch social cues for his life he did so at an infuriatingly slow pace. Deciding to ignore Casper, Edelgard turned back around towards Ash. How are you adjusting to things here, Ash? She asked nonchalantly. I understand that you've been getting along with Petra quite well. It's not like that, he sputtered out. She's just interested in the stories of chivalry Lonato used to tell me. Something about, ideas antiquated yet interesting, . Well, don't get along too well, or Amina will get jealous, she chuckled darkly. But you're fitting in with the Black Eagles so far, correct? A lot, better than I expected, Ash said sheepishly. They've all been very nice to me, even Kamina of all people. Didda's cooking is to die for. And Bernadetta dash. You made friends with Bernie. She blinked in surprise. Bernie. Edelgard said, thanking the goddess her blush was hidden underneath a mask. Let's pretend you didn't hear that. But I'm surprised that you were able to do so. She usually just spends all her time in her quarters. We bond over anime. She rolled her eyes. Huh. Well, she continued, do be nice to her. I'd hate if I had to make you disappear. Should you make Bernadetta sad? I would never, he squeaked. I'm very nice. Relax, I'm only messing with you, she said gently, and a palpable wave of relief washed over Ash's face. Something about his innocence made her want to protect him at all costs. Maybe Ash reminds me of a time when I was an older sister, Edelgard thought, her expression softening for a moment. Then she remembered what she wanted to speak to Ash about, and her mood turned grim once more. I also wanted to let you know that we've been keeping in contact with some of Lonato's men. The ones that went after him. His eyes widened. You know that I would have let you go with them, but apparently Lonato made sure that they kept you safe and out of harm's way in the event of his demise. Lonato's not dead, he said confidently. I'm sure of it. Edelgard wanted to rebuke his naivete and tell him that no one could have survived a direct blast from the hammer, but she also had a strange feeling that there was more to Lonato's supposed death than that. If he had died, then it also meant Thunder Catherine had died, and there was a pretty good chance that the God Emperor wanted her alive. Random soldiers did not matter, but it simply did not make sense for the man to dispose of one of his most decorated warriors. Until Lonato's charred and destroyed body was produced, she could not pronounce him dead just yet. A very slim chance he's not dead, she admitted. But I won't have you look for him. I know, Ash said quietly. Lonato's orders. Anyway, there's a small contingent of his knights that are still in the area of Mount Gaspard. I've been sending them supplies from time to time in exchange for their intel, but they can't search through the rubble until the enforcers garrisoned there are gone. Is Michel leading them? He asked. Yes. I suppose you know him. Tell him thank you for letting me borrow that novel, and that the Flight of Kifon was very good, Ash murmured. That's it. She stared at him blankly. That's all you want to tell him? Yeah. I know you don't have time, and I thought that keeping it short and simple would be fine, so dash. She scoffed audibly. Well, you can tell him yourself, since I'm letting you use the comm line to them whenever you want. Just try not to overuse it, Ash. Really? Thank you, Queen. His face lit up. It means a lot to me, keeping contact with Lonato's soldiers. I was worried I might never see them again. Just be prepared for the moment when you realize, her voice trailed off as she finished the thought in her head. When you realize how many of his men are dead, all for Lonato's foolish gambit. Realize what? She shook her head. Never mind. Just be cautious about what you reveal. You don't know who else is listening in on the line. The operational security stuff, Ash muttered. Got it. She patted him on the shoulder patronizingly, and he flinched a little. Good, dismissed. He blinked twice in surprise, and then nodded silently. As Ash moved to leave, Edelgard turned her attention to the second of her subordinates, who was probably still making a mess of the armory. She moved her head toward the exit where he had left previously, and with all the strength she could muster she bellowed out an order. Casper, she yelled out. Ready to go another round? Hell no, was the muffled reply from her lieutenant, which prompted Ash to laugh. Of all the things Edelgard looked forward to after a long day of work, taking a nice hot shower in the comfort of her own home and falling asleep was probably highest on her list. Unfortunately, she did not have that luxury this time, since she was spending yet another night in her base. The men had taken to calling it the Eagle's Nest, but she found it a bit too flowery for her tastes. Edelgard was not a bird of prey, and these men were certainly not her little hatchlings. But even if she forbade them from using that moniker, it would only stick more, and thus she hoped the stupid name would simply fade away with time. Still, it was her home away from home, and though it was not exactly the same, she had done a good enough job at recreating her own bedroom to suit her tastes. Edelgard liked being alone. None of her subordinates pestering her, or her contacts desperately trying to get a hold of her. She could just be Edelgard von Hresvelg here. Not even Edelgard Eisner, either. She was tired of answering Dorothea and Ingrid's texts. So it was only natural that she instinctively reached for her weapon when Edelgard found Dida sitting at her desk, leafing through some of the paperwork she had set aside for him. He barely reacted to her entry. "Queen," he said gruffly. "Didu," Edelgard said as calmly as she could, gritting her teeth with anger. "What are you doing in my room?" "You gave me access to your quarters," Didu said without missing a beat. "And you did tell me to read over the paperwork here." She sighed. Right. Of course she had. Edelgard had been far too distracted these days to remember. "At any rate," she said, letting the locks on the door engage as she took off her mask. "How long have you been back from the mission?" "Ah, the mission," Didu said, pointedly dodging the question. He closed the dossier in his hands and met Edelgard's gaze as she resisted the urge to flinch under his unwavering stare. "It went well, without any significant problems." "Significant?" "We ran into some resistance, but they were focused on keeping the gold reserves safe. The weapons reserves were quite easy to take, however." "Expected," Edelgard surmised, taking a chair and sliding it across the room to face Didu. "Vanguard is too big of a PMC to care about a few shipments of laser blades going missing. We also managed to recover a decent fortune in anti-tank missiles. It should prove useful the next time we face the Legion head-on. We'll have every man and woman trained in using those," Edelgard murmured. "As for the prospective lieutenant, Ladislava," Didu finished. "She is good at tactical maneuvers. Predicting the enemy as well. Perhaps too good, until we determine where her loyalties truly lie." "I'll speak with her when she's back on base." "Do that, then." "Will that be all, Didu?" Edelgard asked in a monotone voice, moving to get up. He narrowed his gaze. "No. Sit back down, Lady Hrezv Edelgard." She swallowed a lump in her throat. That was the tone Lambert had used whenever she misbehaved, and Didu knew it just as well as he did. Stern and with iron underneath, no threat was necessary to make her comply. And she had been avoiding Didu's serious conversations for the better part of a month, so she supposed sooner or later she would have to face him. "Didu. That's not necessary," she sighed, her voice an octave higher than usual as if she was a mischievous kid again. "I know you well enough to see that you are distracted." Edelgard's silence said more than words could. "You throw yourself into work whenever things are bothering you," he continued. "You have always done this. Master Lambert did the same." "My ability to fight remains unchanged," Edelgard retorted, "no matter who and what is on my mind at any given moment." "And you have become more reckless with each passing day," countered Didu. "Since the day we first reunited you were already too headstrong, and now you return with more and more injuries each time. My regeneration factor is enough to keep me alive for now." "And what happens when the day comes that it is not enough?" Didu asked. His scarred face was wrought with emotions, filled with concern for the last memory left of his old life, their old life. "The Black Eagles will die without you. Then you will ensure that they live without me," Edelgard finished. "Petra and Casper will concede command to you. They are far more valuable in the field than leading. But you have inspired your people, become a hero to them and those who cannot fight. The people of Newfoundland will never trust a man of Dusker," he said flatly. Edelgard was a bit taken aback by that. "Are you saying that the Black Eagles don't trust you? You are just as much of Dash." "No," Didu cut her off. "I have never had any problems with our men. But the people of Newfoundland will always view me as an outsider first. I am only a man of flesh and blood. My reputation can be smeared, my hands bloodied, and my words twisted. But you are already more than that, a symbol. If the fight against the God Emperor is to remain alive, you must as well. Then if it is a symbol the masses need, perhaps we should consider how well my helmet fits on you," Edelgard remarked darkly. "But I digress. You want me to take care of myself more so that it won't come down to that. Is that it, Didu? I am not talking about your grooming or diet." "I am not Hubert," he said, and she bristled at the mention of her old retainer. "I am simply asking you to stop being so reckless." "We can't win without being reckless," Edelgard argued. "We are facing an empire that controls the entire solar system. If we do not take risks, then if we do not die in combat, we die forgotten. Isn't that what we put our lives on the line for? There is a difference between fighting to live a better life and fighting to die a worthy death." You are treading dangerously close to the ladder. Edelgard's face flared with anger. Do not lecture me about why I fight, Didu. I tolerate much from you by virtue of our shared pasts, but don't presume to know more than I do about myself. I am not presuming anything, Queen of Flames. I am simply asking you to put yourself first sometimes. Some rest, perhaps. Give yourself some time to assess the situation the Eagles are in, so that you may fight with a clear head for the next large-scale operation. I am fine, Edelgard replied with irritation, anger slowly building beneath her skin. I am not blind, Lady Edelgard. His words cut like daggers, and despite them coming from Didu it hurt no less than if it had come from the God Emperor himself. Since the mission to recover the Novelli girl, you have been doing nothing but fighting. I may not be as sharp as you, but I can see when you are hurting. Didu remained unrelenting in his interrogation, and Edelgard could not meet his gaze anymore as she pointedly looked down. Your silence about it says enough. I will not ask you for the details, but I urge that you at least talk to Mercedes about it. She would be more than willing to dash. Enough, Didu, she shouted, slamming her palms on the desk hard enough to make even the wall of a man flinch. That is none of your concern. I am no longer your charge, or for that matter, a child you need to coddle. I can handle myself, thank you very much. Didu wore a pained expression on his face. I understand. But dash. Edelgard shook her head angrily. No. I won't entertain any more of your lectures today. Out, Didu. Edelgard, please dash, he tried to interject. I said, get out. Edelgard yelled. Her face turned scarlet with rage, as she pressed her palms into the table so hard that she swore the wood began to crack. Didu sat there, frozen with shock for a moment. Then his expression hardened, to the usual stern look he carried outside of their private conversations. He pushed himself up and out of her chair and moved for the door. She watched him walk, heavy footsteps from his boots clanging throughout the otherwise piercing silence. Before he opened the door, he turned around and looked at Edelgard once last time. I swore an oath to Lambert that I would keep you and your brother safe, Didu said calmly. And if doing so means incurring your wrath, then so be it. Then the door hissed open, and before Edelgard could process what he had just said the door slid shut once more and Didu Molinaro was gone. Edelgard sighed, both from relief that she would not have to hear any more of Didu's words, and from sheer exhaustion. Her heart ached from guilt, for lashing out in her anger at her old friend. Wordlessly she rolled her chair over to the other side of the desk, where Didu had been, and rested her cheeks on her palms like a petulant child. Didu had been right. Her emotional state was a swirling mix of anger and confusion bubbling beneath the surface, hidden beneath the composed mask of the Queen of Flames. No matter how much she threw herself into the work of rebellion, how much blood she spilled, how well she treated her subordinates, she would never face the inescapable truth of her life that way. Edelgard von Hresvelg did not deserve to live. If she were a child, she would have broken down into tears and sobbed until her mother came to comfort her. If she were a teenager, perhaps she would have drowned herself in sullen sorrowness and alcohol. But as the Queen of Flames, she did not have the luxury of resigning herself to defeat. Perhaps she did not deserve to live. But there were many others far more undeserving of life, and so long as they died first then she would have a reason to keep fighting. With a sweep of her arm, she scattered the documents off of her desk and into the air. Paper and plastic cascaded down around her, as she rested her weary head on the ivory wood and begged for the sweet embrace of sleep. No doubt the nightmares would come, but at least she could fight the demons that lurked in her dreams. She could not fight her own heart. Dimitri. Am I truly cut out for this? If only you were alive instead of me. Chapter 43, Digging Up the Past. You have to come to terms with the fact that she is dead. You do not know that. How can I live with myself if I do not know for sure? It's an obsession. Sound of table slamming, not a single crumb, after all these years. And yet you keep looking. Ferdinand, you truly cannot fathom just how much it means to me. My only failure. Ever. I have failed more than just her. I have failed her, the Bladdids and the bloodlines of Vestra and Hresvelg. If I do not make this right. Hubert. I am not living in the past. I know I have you now. But I just... And if you had to choose? Between the memory of your charge and me? Glass shatters in the distance. Recording ends here. Recorded audio number 43 by Flesh Burgleys. How long are you planning to slumber? You cannot run away from your problems in dreams, little one. I have shielded you from your nightmares for now, but it is merely a brief respite. The past is immutable. But the future, well, that is for you to decide. In every world you are the spark. The spark that sets the heavens ablaze. Care that you do not burn it all down in your rage. It was still night when she went out for a drive on her hover bike. Edelgard was still feeling groggy from her brief slumber on her desk, and a dull ache in her bones confirmed that she had certainly not gotten enough sleep. But she needed to go for a ride to clear her head, and so she donned a simple motorcycle helmet, slipped on a basic bodysuit and went off into the darkness once more. She had never been a biker girl like some of the more rowdy members of Abyss. Most of the inter-district highways were reserved for official transports, and only the side roads were available for the general public to use. And there was no real reason to drive, when the maglev took half the time and zero effort at all. But the feeling of wind rushing past her body, the exhilarating sensation of pushing the limits of her bike, it was something she could not simply give up for convenience. So on the nights where she had nothing better to do, she took her hoverbike for a spin and hoped that her ride would be as quiet as the slumbering world around her. The tunnels of Abyss gave way to the moonlight above, heading out of Mach and towards Galatea district. It was a cold night, and the more she drove the more she resisted the urge to shiver. Though her body could take temperatures far below freezing, the sensation of cold still bothered her mind. Perhaps it reminded her too much of the freezing prison cell she had spent the twilight of her youth in. Winding roads and shrubbery gave way to Route 15, one of the few highways available for civilian use. On each side the concrete buildings of New Fodlan rose up around her, their lights blinding her if she looked too far off the road. Conand and Remire were on each side of the road, and the thought came to her that she had purposefully not taken Route 11 in order to avoid returning to Gaspard district once again. Things aren't adding up, she thought as she continued to keep her eyes peeled on the road. She did her best to keep her mind off the thoughts of her argument with Didu, and the swirling memories of her past that didn't quite make sense. Those would only give her a headache, which was the last thing she wanted when driving. The road was where she could be truly alone, not as the Queen of Flames, but as her own self. So instead, Edelgard distracted herself by going over the documents in her head that she had recovered from underneath Mount Gaspard. First on the docket was Happy's journal. She had not had the opportunity to pore over each and every bit of text in it. That was for Yuri and Balthus to do, and they certainly were taking their sweet time with it. But she had managed to scan a decent section of the book while they weren't looking, mostly the latest entries, stretching back approximately half a year. The woman had been a poor diarist by any means. Sure, she was far more eloquent in her writing than her brusque manner of speech, but it only served to make reading her diary more confusing. The entries were few and far between, and Edelgard had a hard time following her train of thought even throughout a single entry. Every once in a while, however, she would come across a nugget of truth that proved more useful than any lab report or stolen manifesto. Heaven was the missing piece of my research. It is the catalyst for all genetic transmutation, and yet no one can come up with a conclusive explanation for how it works. She thought of the poison running through her own veins, the feeling of a million voices in her head threatening to reduce her to an empty vessel. The memories scared her, but not because of the pain she had felt. It was because the feeling of heaven was simply so intoxicating. No doubt it had played a key part in her augmentations and enhanced strength. And yet why is heaven a street drug if it is so valuable? Happy had asked that question, and Edelgard still did not know how to answer it. It was worth several dozen times its weight in gold, and yet small amounts constantly trickled onto the black market as an escape drug. Surely pharmaceutical companies would be paying top dollar for each and every drop, not to mention the magistrate itself. But who was supplying heaven in the first place? I should be dead by now. I have failed in every possible way in making the super soldiers that my superiors supposedly desire. And yet I am not dead. Is it that they want the monsters more? Edelgard shook her head, a bit of her platinum hair falling out of her helmet and tumbling down toward her neck. With her free hand, she reached over to tuck the stray strands of hair back into her suit. She certainly did not need to be recognized in her lowest state, even if there was absolutely no one in the dead of the night on the mountain road. There are certain noble families that have specific genetic markers that make them more receptive to experimentation. But if you induce those same genetic changes on someone not part of those bloodlines, then you end up with monsters. Why is that, I wonder? The Hresvelgs were supposedly one of them. And yet every single one of her cousins had died painfully, screaming until the blood gurgled inside their throats and turned to whimpers. She shut her eyes in a grimace only to barely make a left turn in time. Out of all of them, only Edelgard von Hresvelg survived. Perhaps the goddess had been looking out for her or had a higher purpose planned. But that was the thinking of a devout believer, and Edelgard no longer believed in anything beside her own strength. Happy's words rang hollow in her ears. It did not surprise her at all that the monsters they encountered below Mount Gaspard had once been human. No chimera of animals could produce something as grotesque and resilient to human weaponry. They were merely poor souls that simply did not have the fortune, or misfortune, of being born to Newfoundland's elite. And though Edelgard suspected the once human monsters had not exactly been innocent souls, it was clear to her that no one deserved that fate. Well, maybe the God Emperor did. And perhaps the Regan boy. I would die for her. I have no doubts about that. The tighter Edelgard took her corners and the faster she drove, the more her mind began to clear up from the fog that had been blinding her judgment for the last few weeks. There was simply something cathartic about having the wind at her back and shooting through the night, the grav engine purring beneath her hands tightly gripping the handlebars. It was enough for her to recognize how much of a fool she had been, focusing too much on her own personal vendetta and not enough on her rebellion. Below her the city lights began to fade, little specks of neon flickering as she passed them. Peeling off a little-used exit on the freeway, she made a hard right turn, drifting several feet to the side of the road in the process. While it lacked the tactile feedback of drifting on a smoothly paved road, turning with the hoverbike had a certain airy charm to it. It did handle like a dream, and she swore to Linhard that she would take better care of the bike in the future. The higher she went on the mountain road, the more the moon began to illuminate the world around her in a faint light. Cascading spires of rock and rolling slopes of grass rose up around her, shrouding her ascent beneath the cover of darkness. All was still in the night of Newfoundland, save for a lone woman and her bike heading toward where her heart pointed her. Her final conclusion from Happy's diary was that Magistrate was on the verge of a breakthrough. Happy had been creating monsters, most likely in an attempt to create augmented soldiers without the need for special genetic markers. And yet the monsters themselves were clearly being kept around due to their usefulness, their skin and bones, perhaps. Edelgard could only take a stab in the dark. Why? The presence of Constance and the Ashen Demon unnerved her greatly. Someone like Thunder Catherine could be killed with overwhelming might, and if that failed, then clever guile would do the trick. But whatever had been done to them was simply something else entirely. It was only a matter of time before more appeared, and Edelgard suspected her next encounter with such power would prove a fatal one. She grimaced at the thought of being outmatched and outgunned. There were several projects Linhard had been working on to improve the Queen of Flames' combat performance metrics, not to mention that of the Eagles. But most of them were technological in nature, and that meant that it was only as strong as its weakest link. A more efficient memory alloy might only work at a certain temperature, a miniaturized fusion toroid could be destabilized by impact, energy shields could be destroyed by specialized frequencies and colliding energies. There was the ever-looming threat that one day, Linhard's creations would fail, or it simply would be enough against the might of the Empire. There was a clear gap between Edelgard and the Ashen Demon that she could not bridge, and an even larger gap between her and her men. Perhaps Happy's research could be the key, she thought, before immediately regretting it. Something in the back of her head screamed at the thought, reeled at the sickening idea of ripping another person open just as the Magistrate had done. She felt a minor flush of anger at the thought of using the tools of her torturer to gain an advantage. But the main thought that dominated was a cold indifference, cool as the night breeze. Long ago she had already declared that she would do whatever was necessary to win. It was a morbid thought, but she could not deny the appeal of having an equal amongst the Black Eagles in strength. The only question was who would be willing to give their mind and body toward victory, perhaps sacrificing it all for the sake of strength. It's simple. They do not need to be willing. She bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. Then I would be no better than the magistrate. Edelgard nearly shot off the road before the autopilot kicked in, the hoverbike careening to the side as it struggled to swerve back onto the pavement. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, swirling with half-baked ideas and fears about the future. Was she capable of making the right call if it came down to it? Could she give the lives of a few to save the many? The more she thought, the more erratically she drove. But going up the winding road as it snaked its way up the rocky terrain was a problem for her autopilot to handle. Edelgard allowed her mind to wander, her crumbling mental state struggling to remain composed under the current conditions. Her little argument with Didu had rattled her not only because he was right, but because it reminded her of when she was a child and he was reprimanding her for being careless. Those were memories that she preferred to leave in the past. They were good ones, but she disliked having to remember anything at all. As she neared the summit of the hill, Edelgard flicked a small switch below her right thumb that disengaged the autopilot. The bike jerked for a moment as she struggled to adjust it back to its proper position, before applying a gentle pressure with her right arm to steer it straight. Her eyes were fixed firmly on the road before her. If she looked to her sides, she might have succumbed to the sickly thrall of nostalgia. It was a road she had taken many times before. The leaves were a brilliant shade of green, though the foliage on the sides of the road had grown awry without someone to constantly prune them. She recognized the smooth curves of the road, the specific bend where her brothers and retainers used to kick a ball around, and the winding path further upwards. And once she saw it, she no longer could keep her eyes glued to the road. A small house peeked above the horizon as she gunned the throttle, blue energy flaring behind her and into the darkness. It was just as she remembered it, a small villa, with terracotta shingling and white sheeting, surrounded by several gardens and a never-ending hill of grass. The blinds, too, were the same, left open to catch the rays of sunlight just as her mother liked. Her eyes flickered to the door and front porch, where she and her stepfather had watched the sunset an uncountable number of times, lighting a cigar despite her mother's protests, whereas Edelgard sipped on a juice box. Even the small skid marks from when her mother had accidentally braked too hard remained. It was just as she had left it. Well, Edelgard thought as she continued to drive upwards, that was only mostly true. Year by year the house grew a bit more overgrown, the bright white of the house fading as the years passed. She made it a point to visit her stepfather's villa on the outskirts of Ferdayad ever since she had become the Queen of Flames. Usually she did so on the anniversary of the tragedy of Dusker, in the dead of night so that no one would know, but Edelgard decided it was as good a time as ever to pay her parents a visit. They certainly were not buried here. She had no idea where the bodies were, if they were even still intact at all, but it was the closest thing to a resting place that they had. The security systems buzzed in protest as they detected an unknown visitor, but she only had to flip on her jammer to make sure that they wouldn't phone home. The ones installed in the Bladdid summer home had been state-of-the-art, complete with an automated deployment of laser traps, so that enforcers could collect the intruders with impunity. They had been activated a few times over the years, mostly from petty robbers and squatters looking for a place to live. If it was up to her, Edelgard would have probably let them live there. She had taken everything valuable and memorable from the house years ago, or at least what Rufus Bladdid had deemed too worthless to sell. But then again, she was legally dead, and she herself was now intruding on the property that belonged to her worthless step-uncle. The security systems might have been cutting edge half a decade ago, but now they were as easily bypassable as getting through maglev security checkpoints. A summer breeze running through her hair. The sound of happy children and their giggles. The promise of a warm embrace and home-cooked dinner. Such was life as a Bladdid. Her life as a Hresvelg, too, would have been free of suffering. To be happy was all she ever wanted as a child. It only made sense that it would carry over to her adult life, and her family would be the same as they were 10 or 20 years later. The concept of suffering simply did not exist to her as a child. She was nothing but a naive little girl, raised on privilege, born from the suffering of all those below her on the hierarchy of New Fodlan. She did not deserve to have it all, to have a happy life with her newfound family after losing her father to the powers that be. Edelgard knew that without suffering, she would have been weak. Adversity tempered the strongest of souls, and what she had been through would have broken a lesser man. In a sense, the tragedy of Dusker made her who she was. Though she was loath to admit it, it was necessary for little Edelgard to die, and the Queen of Flames to take her place. Kill the girl, and let the queen be born. There were so many regrets, so many things left unsaid between her and her family that would never see the light of day. The only thing left to do was to move forward, wading through the ashes of her dead family and fighting for a brighter future. What would she give to see Dima again, though? Would she give up her little rebellion, the promises of a better life, if it meant seeing her little brother alive and healthy once more? Voices in the back of her mind prickled at her skin, cursing her for her dawdling and inaction. They pushed her to press forward, to avenge her dead family, to cut everyone down until the world was naught but bones and ash. The dead were of no use to her though, and she tried her best to keep them in the back of her mind. Sometimes she could not tell if they were side effects from her injection of heaven, or if they were simply signs of ongoing schizophrenia. She remembered that the king of delusions, too, had voices in his head, and then she remembered that she had no idea who she was. Edelgard cursed under her breath. I really am going crazy. I should probably speak to Mercedes about this. Step by step, she brought her knees up and down in a monotone fashion. Edelgard was consumed by waves of memories, remembering all that had happened here in the Bladded villa, and all that she had lost. The gravel road gave way to a softer cobble walkway, where she could spot some of the marks Dima had made many years ago. Dima was here. She took one last look at the house before her, silent and foreboding as ivy ran up and down the rafters, covering the dilapidated siding. The house had remained untouched save for the passage of time, and she knew that if she stepped in, Edelgard would be taking a step back into her childhood. The overwhelming urge to walk in, to touch the banisters and the fireplace that she would curl up beside at night, tempted her sorely. But she would not. Everything of value was gone. The only thing left was an empty house for no one to grow old in. Edelgard took a deep breath and turned where the cobble pathway split into two. This path went towards the gardens, where her mother had spent most of her days carefully pruning each and every single flower. She used to ask her why she even bothered, when a computerized system could keep every single plant in the prime of their lives until their time came. There was no need for a human to do it, so why did she? Because, her mother chided. The plants are good for me. But they don't move or say anything, Mom. What can they possibly do for you? I have everything I ever wanted in life, she said, smiling. I'm happy. I just want to take the time and smell the roses sometimes. And what better way to do that than here? Peepops says it's not necessary, Edelgard awkwardly sputtered. That Didu should be doing it anyway, so that you don't get your dress dirty. Lambert's a bit old-fashioned sometimes. He never had an appreciation for the finer things in life, she said wistfully, patting her daughter on the head. But we all have our moments. Don't we, my sweet daughter? Would you care to join me for some gardening? Her words came out as a low whisper. I don't know how to garden. Dida never taught me. I'd rather not get in the way. Well, it's better now than never, her mother said, laughing. Go get a pair of jeans and join me outside. I'll be taking care of this little flower in the concrete. It only took a smile from her mother to wipe away all her insecurities, her fears of not being good enough to make her parents proud. Okay, Mom, she chirped. Give me a few minutes. And with that, she trotted away out of the garden and back into the house, unaware that she was trailing mud behind her the entire time. Hubert gave her an earful when she returned, that it was unbecoming of her as a lady. But she didn't care. Now she knew how to garden, and she would have only the prettiest flowers in her garden. Except, of course, for the single wilted flower that rose from a crack in the center of the concrete right outside the garden. One day, she promised herself. One day it would bloom. And she would be there to see it. After a minute or so of searching, she found it. How improbable was it that the flower bloomed, a brilliant crimson unfurling its petals beneath the soft light of the sky. Though its stem was jagged and shaky, snaking through the crack in the concrete that had only grown throughout the years, it remained alive and well in spite of its confinement. The dull green gave way to a beautiful shade of red, glistening with a bit of night dew. She knelt down for a second, enthralled by the urge to pluck and smell it. But she hesitated. Something like that deserved its own life, pushing past the odds to bloom brilliantly. And this was no longer her own garden, it was left to nature to weed out the weak from the strong. Edelgard did not have the right to pluck it, she was merely an observer. A smile graced her face beneath the mouthguard of her helmet. If she had been a believer like Mercedes, she would have seen it as a sign of divine providence, a symbol of the goddess. But she had seen enough of the world to know that the goddess had probably died long ago, and instead chalked it up to fate. Fate was what had brought her here, all the way back home. Fate was what kept her from joining her family. She waded through the garden, past the pond in the backyard and all the way through a fenced-off area to where her parents were waiting for her. It was a pitiful sight, seeing the yard like this. Leaves were scattered haphazardly, the ground covered with weeds that crowded out the browning grass. Any semblance of a path was covered in shrubbery and moss, slowly reclaiming what was left of the Bladed estate for Mother Nature. But at least the large oak tree that blotted out the moonlight with its dense foliage remained, unmoving and unbending to the flow of time. It had been there long before Edelgard was born, and it would be there long after she was dead and rotting. Underneath the tree were several headstones neatly laid out in a fenced-off plot. Large slabs of carefully cut rock stood firm, though the engravings were worn and weathered from the passage of time. A gate barred her vision, which she hopped as gently as she could in order to avoid disturbing the silence of the night. The laser barrier that protected the graveyard had long been shut off, so it was no problem at all to hop over. She still landed on her boots, though she made sure to leave as little of a mark as possible. The first row had been there for longer than she remembered. They were the Bladeds of the past, her grandfathers and grandmothers by marriage, who had decided to be buried not at the ancestral Bladed crypt but rather at the summer villa. Somewhere down the line one of her ancestors had decided that he would prefer being one with the earth rather than be preserved for all eternity in an airtight coffin, so those who had chosen a natural burial would be buried here. Still, they were not exactly her relatives by blood, so she had always paid them little attention aside from being careful to not kick a ball into the graveyard on accident. The second row, however, had been added several years ago. It was by the man who settled the Bladed estate, who remained anonymous in spite of Edelgard's attempts to pry. From what she had managed to dig up, it seemed the mysterious executor of the will had been fending off attempts from her step-uncle, who wanted to claim the villa for himself in spite of the will specifying it be preserved for future generations. It had to have been a friend of her stepfather, perhaps it was the one friend of Lambert that she had actually met. There were 4 graves here. Anselma Patricia Bladed. Lambert Egypt Bladed. Dmitri Alexander Bladed. Edelgard von Hresvelg. Last time she was here, she had spoken to the graves of her parents. Edelgard von Hresvelg was, for all intents and purposes, mostly sane. She knew that they were most definitely not listening, and even if they were, they would not care what she had to say. But it certainly helped to rationalize the world in terms of what her parents would have thought. It did help to talk things through with her parents, even if they were dead, and sometimes hearing a response in her head would confirm that she was going a bit off the deep end. It was harder to speak to the grave of her brother. Not when it's my fault that he's dead. I can't. She shook her head and knelt down before her mother's grave. Mother. I'm sorry for letting the flowers wilt in your absence. But I'm back. Just wanted to let you know. I haven't found Father yet. I can count the number of times I've thought of him in the last 5 years on one hand. Flames of Alel, I barely even remember his face. But I've always wanted to know if he was really guilty of what they said he was guilty for. Was my birth father, the last patriarch of the Hresvelg family, really the evil man the world portrayed him to be? I have so many questions about you and Father that I don't even know where to start. Did you love him? Did you divorce him to protect yourself or to distance yourself? Were you sad when they took him away and everything that the two of you owned together? Or were you relieved that you could finally be safe? But that's all in the past now, since it's not like I can ask you anymore. I never even had the chance to say goodbye as your car burned in the flames of Dusker. All I can hope is that you're resting well. Edelgard blinked a few tears away, muttering the motto of the Hresvelg family. Strength in blood. She gently got up and moved to her left, looking directly at the grave of her father. Here lies Lambert Egypt Bladed. A good man. Edelgard did not remember the exact moment when she began to consider Lambert as a father. The affectionate nickname of Pops had been a name for years, but it was only in the twilight of her adolescence that she had begun to see him less of a mentor and more as a paternal figure. By all means the head of the Bladdid family should have rejected her. She was a Hresvelg, and the relations between the two families had been less than cordial in the past. But he had treated her as if she were his own flesh and blood, taking the young girl under his wing and training her in the careful arts of business and politics. I never got to thank you for being a father to me. Would Edelgard have taken the Bladdid name, erasing all traces of her disgraced blood father from her history and starting anew? She knew the answer to that deep down, locked in one of her stepfather's filing cabinets that she had sorted through many years ago. The adoption papers were there left unsigned, waiting for the right moment. She would have said yes, but it did not erase the fact that she was the last Hresvelg. And though her line had fallen from grace many years before, there was no doubt in her mind that Edelgard von Hresvelg remained a Hresvelg in mind and spirit. The past could not be changed. But the future, she could mold as she wished, and so she decided to leave her father and the Bladdid name as it was. She could not speak to Dimitri just yet. That was for when she toppled the God Emperor off of his golden throne and cut him to pieces, and only then would Edelgard have truly avenged him. There was far more left to do, and so she moved on to the last grave in the row. Edelgard von Hresvelg. She wondered who or what was buried underneath here, if there even was one in the lead-lined coffin down below. But it didn't matter anyway. In her mind's eye Edelgard could see her child self, sleeping peacefully and becoming one with the earth below. Things would have been a lot easier if she was the one down there, free of any earthly desires or motives. She would have been at peace, free of the survivor's guilt that haunted her so. Yet it was the same guilt that drove her. There were many who were wronged by the magistrate, lost their friends and family to unspeakable horrors, covered up by bureaucracy and black ink. But there was only one in the world who would have their revenge by any means necessary. Her fist curled up into a ball as she remembered all that she had lost, those who had died so that she could be here today. I must be alive for a reason, she thought solemnly. Maybe Mercedes was right about the goddess looking out for me. But she was too vain to truly believe that, and so the voice that whispered angrily in the back of her mind remained unheard. Placing her head gently on the headstone that bore her name, she began to speak. Not yet, Edelgard von Hresvelg spoke, her voice no more than a whisper. In due time. Who dares defile my lady's grave? Growled a voice from the darkness. Her blood went cold as she froze. She had neglected to do the usual checks for people tailing her, and she had turned off tracking in the heat of the moment. Nobody visited the old Bladdid villa, that much she knew for certain. And yet that voice, it couldn't be. I am asking you again, the voice said, closer this time. Now the moonlight revealed the man's full figure, and she resisted the urge to scream. It was Hubert von Vestra. Of all people. It seemed like decades ago when she had last seen him, or at least saw the hologram of him right before the MX4 attacked. But something in her bones told her that he was real in the flesh, not just some cheap trick to get her out in the open. No, this was Hubert, all right. A dark overcoat fluttered in the breeze, hiding the collared shirt and tie underneath. In one hand he clutched a tablet of some sort, and in the other he held a dagger that shone a faint red, the same hue that she used for her axe. Messy black hair hung partly over his eyes, though where the hair thinned it was neatly combed. His grey eyes were gaunt and sunken, no doubt a result of his odd sleeping schedule all the way from when he was her retainer. It was a far cry from the perfectly groomed man that had greeted her right before nearly killing her. That was the Deputy Director of Intelligence speaking. This was the human underneath. And no matter how much he towered over her or which master he served, some things about the Vestra stayed the same. Though she turned to get a closer look, she did not move to get up from where she was kneeling. Hubert would have been a fool to engage her around the graves of his charges. That was something even he would not do. If she was right, then it would buy her some precious seconds to escape. And if she was not, well, she could kill him without any regrets. That would mean that he had forsaken the duty of his family and the girl who he had sworn his fealty to. She paused for a second. I am simply paying my respects. And for what reason? He asked menacingly, his expression a sneer of disdain. As if she was simply beneath him. The Bladdids have been dead for years. Her mind turned, thinking of all the possible ways she could turn the situation to her advantage. As it stood, the situation remained dire. Hubert was the smartest man she knew. He would certainly connect the dots between the mysterious invader of the villa and the Queen of Flames, or worse, he could ascertain her true identity given how careless she had been. But if she could simply use that to her advantage. "I am not here for them," she said simply. "I owe a debt. One that can no longer be repaid as is." "I greatly dislike when people speak in riddles," he hissed. "Choose your words carefully, or they will be your last." "The girl you knew as Edelgard died so that I could live," she said beneath the motorcycle helmet. "I do what I do in her honor." This was not entirely a lie, of course. Edelgard von Hresvelg had died that day. But it was not the day when her stepfather and mother were killed, or even when the doctors cut her open and stitched her back together until she was nothing but a lab experiment. It had been the day that Dima died, the only reason why she had continued to live. Though she had been loath to admit it at first, it was the day that the Queen of Flames had been born. "You're lying," Hubert von Vestra growled. "I would have dash. You would have known," she said mockingly. "You were not there when she died, when your lady needed you most." It pained her to say those words, when she knew that there was nothing her retainer could have done but die as well. But if he truly had sided with the killers of her family, then it did not matter how deep her words cut. "I searched every nook and cranny, every crumb of information for an iota of knowledge of my lady's whereabouts." "How dare you question my loyalty?" Hubert snarled, rage bubbling up and threatening to consume him. "At least some things don't change. She spoke highly of you, Vestra. I would have expected no less. You know too much. Who are you?" He raised his dagger, sizzling with energy. Edelgard shook her head with feigned, and a touch of genuine, sadness. "I am no one," she replied. "Just a stranger passing through the night." "You said she died for you," he repeated. "Tell me, or I'll dash." "Or what?" she said mockingly. "You'll kill me? There are far worse things than death in this world, you know. It would be a mercy. I simply have to keep you alive until you talk." Underneath her motorcycle helmet, her blank expression turned dour. Torture was one thing, but torture by the hands of her former protector? "That won't be necessary," she replied coldly. "I have no reason to hide anything from you." "And yet you speak in accursed riddles," he said as his temper flared, "as if you are hiding something far greater. I should rip that motorcycle helmet off your head dash. I will answer one of your questions." "One." "Just one," she said, raising a single finger for emphasis. "The rest will come in due time. Do you believe me naive enough to trust you?" "No. But I know one thing," Edelgard admitted. "Men like you trust no one except yourself. I do not expect you to believe me, but I can lead you to the truth. And when it stares you in the face, cold and bitter beyond imagining, only then will you admit that I was not lying in the first place. Then tell me, how did my lady Edelgard, how did she die?" His face was racked with barely restrained emotion, lips curled somewhere between a snarl and a sorrowful grimace. His eyes flickered back and forth from her to the graveyard behind her, and it was at that moment that she knew that Hubert could be swayed in the future. He had always been too emotional underneath, hiding his true feelings beneath a veneer of cost-benefit analyses and rationality. All she had to do was sow the seeds of dissent, and he would begin to question his loyalties. She sighed theatrically. The magistrate took her. Experimented on her, until she was nothing but skin and bones, and her voice was barely higher than a whisper. "She died so that the rest of us could live. They took her," he said shakily. "Ah. Either you cannot fathom that the magistrate could do such a thing, or you simply have refused to believe it. But the evidence speaks for itself." Hubert von Vestra remained silent, his brow furrowed in thought. "I ask you this. Did they ever exhume the body? Bury it beneath this grave? How many lies did they tell to convince you that Dusker was responsible?" "I cannot tell you that," he said shakily. "Then you know the answer. I suggest you get a shovel." "What?" he replied, cocking his head in confusion. She turned and looked at the gravestone with her own name on it. "Whatever is buried underneath here is most certainly not your liege. The real Edelgard von Hresvelg is no more than ash in an incinerator. How dare you dash?" In an instant, Hubert closed the distance, coming from behind and pressing the knife to her throat. His arm was locked in a chokehold around her neck, though it was painfully obvious to her that he was still lanky as ever. If Edelgard so wished, she could have skewered him with his own knife before he even had time to gasp, but that was not the point. It took every inch of her willpower to not do so instinctively, but she was able to keep it steady. "You would ask me to disgrace her grave? I should kill you for that insult alone," he growled. "I ask nothing of anyone," she said quietly. "But if you care about the truth, then I am presenting you an opportunity to do so. If you have truly spoken with Edelgard, then you can tell me about her, before I do the honors of taking you in and disposing of your body." There was a taut silence, as her mind struggled to articulate the words that she had always wanted to say to Hubert when the day of their inevitable reunion came. She had always imagined that it would be on opposing sides of conflict, but this was something far beyond that. There was hope for him, and hope fluttering in her own heart was nothing more than poison. It was only after that realization that she pressed her lips together and began to speak. Edelgard was kind. Overconfident and brash, but kind. She would always cover her little brother's eyes whenever we passed by blood and gore, in a vain attempt to shield him from the horrors of the facility. She always remained composed until he was asleep, until one night I heard her sobbing as quietly as she could, her brother blissfully unaware as he slumbered next to her. Hubert's grip softened, and she heard the sound of the energy dagger falling onto the soft dirt beneath them. The cold clinical detachment in her voice startled her. She felt more like an observer looking into her memories, rather than digging through her own trauma for ammunition. It would have broken her heart to lie more to her oldest friend. "And her brother?" Hubert whispered. "They did not share the same blood," she muttered. "And yet she cared for Dima all the same." Hubert stood up, letting the dagger rest on the ground as he rose to his full height. Only then could she turn to face him, the only thing separating them being a centimeter of visor glass. She watched as his facial muscles contorted, struggling to keep a handle on things after his world had just been shattered. His eyes were now wide, in an expression that she had rarely ever seen on him. Shock. "Either you are in fact Edelgard," he said shakily, "or you are telling the truth. I do not know which one is worse." Edelgard's blood chilled for a moment, but she instinctively shook her head to deny his accusation. "I am not worthy of that name. I am no one. Insignificant to the world, to your magistrate. The only thing I wish to do is to honor her memory." Hubert remained unmoving. "Is that truly so? Take me in if you must. But you will never find the answers you seek that way. Not when the magistrate remains as it is." She whipped her eyes around her surroundings, searching for possible escape routes if her bluff failed. Darting from corner to corner of her vision, she managed to identify several plans in less than half a second. But the best plan, and the one without risk at all, was simply taking advantage of Hubert to walk out of the old Bladded estate unscathed. "I have more questions." He started. Edelgard held one finger up to her lips, or at least where her lips would have been had it not been covered by metal and plastic. "In due time," she said simply. "Do the words, blood reconstruction, mean anything to you?" He shook his head in confusion. "I suggest looking into it. The Novelli papers would be a good place to start, if you somehow get access to them. If not, well, you know where to find me now." She shifted her stance, ready to leave her past behind and walk toward the future. "Goodbye, Hubert von Vestra." And with that, Edelgard von Hresvelg, clad in the disguise of a biker girl, walked past her oldest friend with no more than a sorrowful glance in his direction. Her heart was still racing at the thought of being caught, and the fear of any communication networks or drones had picked her presence up. But she knew that Hubert was smart enough to cover his tracks, and in her heart she knew that Hubert would not betray her, or at least the memory of her, just yet. And indeed, he did not move until she was out of sight, perhaps still fixated on his recently shattered world. It broke her heart to lie to him of all people. But it was necessary, she told herself. She repeated that mantra over and over as she walked out of the gardens, toward the entrance of her old home and back toward the shining city below. Slowly but surely her breath began to return to normal. She should have been happy that she managed to outwit one of the most brilliant minds of the magistrate, making a mockery of Deputy Director Vestra. But instead, her stomach began to twist with guilt. In the distance, a shovel hit the dirt. Then again. And again and again and again. Chapter 44, The Best Man. Like most of the old Faerghus aristocratic bloodlines, the Frildarius family remains quite tight-lipped about their traditions and influence. The anointment of the line as noble came from Kiphon Frildarius's involvement in the War of Unification, for his leadership in the Battle of Galatia. But it was not until a couple centuries later, after producing several renowned knights and generals, that Frildarius Securities came to be by way of its founder, Leni Frildarius. She created the first Frildarius security system, which was deemed impossible to break into with the tools available at the time. The legacy of the Frildarius family has continued, though some say their tight connection with the recently destroyed Bladdid family may prove their downfall. A History of Faerghus's Elite, page 312. She washed her bitter memories down with a handle of lugs. Vodka was her preferred drink of choice, but sometimes the occasion called for whiskey. Whiskey was good. It helped her forget, and forgetting was paradise. Only in the safety of her own home could Edelgard drink with abandon. With friends, she drank until only a hint of a blush formed on her cheeks, as to avoid spilling secrets not meant to be let out in the open. And as the Queen of Flames well, it was rather hard to drink with a helmet on. So once she was safely tucked away in her little and bare villa, far away from the magistrate's clutches or the curious eyes of her black eagles, she drank. And drank and drank and drank. She awoke in the dead of night. Immediately Edelgard bolted to her feet, barely taking the time to cover herself before she leapt out of bed. Where was she? It took a few seconds before she was able to compose herself, her blurry vision coming to terms with the fact that she was inside her own room. The oak pillars and rustic decor told her as much, and though her head throbbed she at least knew that she was safe. Or was she? Her heart raced as she struggled to trace her steps. Was she followed? Her last memories were, having an argument with Dida the night before. That wasn't quite right. She had talked to Hubert before. At her own grave. The memories came flooding back to her in bits and pieces, struggling to put them together to form a coherent narrative. She had bluffed her way out of capture, masquerading as a witness rather than as the deceased Edelgard. She had raced back to Abyss as soon as she could, taking a winding path to ensure that she would not be followed. Then, nothing. A quick glance to her bedside explained why. 2 empty bottles of lugs. Edelgard cursed audibly, though it was not as if anybody was there to hear it. Somehow in her years as a mercenary for hire she had managed to drink even more than old Gerald himself ever imagined. Not the best of habits to pick up from her fellow mercenaries and not exactly something her subordinates needed to see. It was fine for Gerald because it was part of his rustic charm or however Leone put it, but for her, she had to be perfect. She was not a grizzled mercenary anymore, she was the de facto leader of a rebellion. It was a vice that would have to stop one of these days. At least the hangovers subsided rather quickly, as a side result of her augmentations and enhanced metabolism. That amount of alcohol would have been enough to knock anyone out, and give them a crippling headache for at least a couple of days. She, on the other hand, would only have to endure the grogginess for a few more hours before she came to her senses. How long have I slept? It occurred to her that it was night once again, which meant that nearly a full day had passed since she paid respects to the old Bladdid estate. Another day wasted, she thought half-heartedly. Time was running out, and here she was drinking away her problems rather than facing them head-on. A glance at her clock confirmed her suspicions. As she threw on a basic semblance of clothes and headed down to her dining room, where a small microwaved meal had been prepared by her robo-butler, Edelgard made an attempt to keep her head focused on the fight ahead. The next step. What is the next step? She had been chasing her own demons for so long that she had nearly forgotten her mission. For the last month, the Eagles were glorified scavengers, picking away at abandoned bases and warehouses left undefended. There were the occasional skirmishes with the magistrate, including one unfortunate incident involving Didu and a tuning fork, but they were few and far between. Edelgard rationalized this to her subordinates as gathering resources for the fight ahead. If we are to win, it will be through subterfuge, not open conflict. We must first obtain the resource lines necessary to fight a prolonged war. She had begun with a little under 24 men several months ago. Now, with the addition of the men and women of Dusker, Along with the steady trickle of recruits that her captains approved, the Black Eagles numbered a little under 100. Only 60 of them were combat-ready, the others served as informants, spies, and saboteurs. To supply them with the weapons and rations needed for conflict, her men had been aggressively raiding every convoy and depot that they could. Several of the new recruits had died in the process, but she chalked it up as a failure on her captain's parts. Oh right. They're captains now. She made a mental reminder to approve Amina's proposal for an org chart, now that her forces were beginning to grow larger. Then there were the Queen's allies, the Blade Breakers, Berling's mercenaries, the Golden Deer, Lonato's soldiers, and perhaps the Mockingbird's men if he finally stopped mourning the loss of his dear friend. Though she could not count on the men individually, she knew that their leaders were all beholden to her in one way or another. She fired off a quick series of messages to Petra and Casper detailing some of her plans, and signing off on a few targets they had lined up. Casper was raiding a facility his father owned. Interesting. She wondered how the retired general would feel about that, considering his reputation as a folk hero of the Empire. Petra was planning a recon mission on one of the many abandoned labs scattered around Newfoundland, though this time she made a request for flamethrowers and heavy weaponry. Edelgard signed off on that heartily, though she, of course, would not be accompanying them on their mission. Then there was Didu. She kept her communications short and curt, mostly involving the recent recruits, and how to integrate them well. If she was going to apologize to him, she would do it in person. Her outburst had been uncalled for, and thus it warranted an apology. After all, she had just recently seen Hubert, and at least Didu had not sided with the magistrate. She would certainly consult with Didu on how to handle the situation. Though Didu had certainly never enjoyed Hubert's company, there was a begrudging respect for each other considering their respective lieges. From what she understood, and a bit of her own intuition, Hubert had joined the magistrate because there was nowhere left for him to go. The Vestras had historically been tied with the intelligence division anyway, so it was only natural for him to join if everybody he knew was dead. All they had to do was pin it on the people of Dusker. It was a good thing Flesh was still stationed as part-time secretary for the Office of Intelligence. Neela was quite good at her job, and quite careful at that. Edelgard would not dare risk her best spy by accessing classified documents, so she served more as an observer to the comings and goings of the office. Though she was not privy to the more private conversations that Deputy Director Vestra had, two things were very clear from her notes. 1. Hubert's access is restricted even within the magistrate. It only made sense he was deputy director. The director, well, she was unsure if he even existed. All she knew was his code name Solon. No doubt he was responsible for keeping Hubert in the dark, to ensure his compliance and loyalty. And 2, Hubert is in love. Madly in love. Hubert's preferences did not come as much of a shock to her. But his partner did, who also had the distinction of being the second most annoying man that she had met in her life. It was difficult for her to wrap her head around at first, but in hindsight, it made perfect sense why they were together. Ferdinand von Aguirre, Enforcer Commissioner, and also heir to the Aguirre dynasty. His father was the current viceroy of Newfoundland, a stout and pudgy man who threw lavish parties and overindulged. She expected him to follow in his footsteps, but Edelgard was quite surprised when he proved to be a quite competent leader. It meant he could be reasoned with, but it also threw quite a wrench in her plans. As a child, he had been nothing but a nuisance as a child, always trying to one-up Hubert and Edelgard at the parties hosted by Inver's social elites. And as an adult, Edelgard had humiliated him as the Queen of Flames, snatching Didu right from beneath his nose. There was an angle of opportunity. All she had to do was get to Ferdinand, and Hubert would follow soon after. He was competent, but not shrewd. She knew how to read him. All she needed was time. It was easier, she thought, to bring both of them. Turning the junior Aguirre against the magistrate would be difficult, but it would prove a valuable boon if the enforcers turned a blind eye to the Black Eagle's comings and goings. There was no doubt that Hubert would follow soon after. If he hadn't already been sympathetic to their cause, then he would certainly have motive to be after his lover-turned-traitor. Deep down, she did not want to make Hubert choose between love and loyalty. He seemed happy, though it pained her to admit that perhaps he was happier without knowing that she was alive. Edelgard could not in good conscience tear away his happiness just for the sake of his so-called loyalty. After losing everything in his life, it was obvious that Ferdinand was the only thing keeping him together. It didn't take much of Flesh's intelligence to figure that out. Perhaps Ferdinand is the only thing keeping him loyal to the magistrate. She had a few plans in mind, so she jotted down a few quick notes before turning her attention to her civilian pager. One missed message from Glenn. Hi, Edelgard. Ingrid's going to be leaving the hospital tomorrow. Would you have time to stop by for dinner tomorrow at our family estate? No pressure if you can't make it, but she would really appreciate it if you were able to come. The corner of her mouth turned into a frown. She was originally planning to patch things up with Tadu and join on his scouting mission today, but it could wait. She had spent enough time as Edelgard von Hresvelg for a while. It was time for Edelgard Eisner to return to the forefront. Perhaps seeing her friends again would help put things into perspective, spending time away from all the blood and scheming that she had been doing over the last few weeks. It was the only thing keeping her grounded in reality. And yet there was that feeling of fear she felt whenever she put on the mask. It was the fear of rejection, the fear of being discovered, the knot in her stomach when she thought of her perfect life crashing down as her friends discovered the truth. She would have taken combat any day over masquerading as a vain woman who flitted about in her daily existence. But it was necessary for her operations, and there was an undeniable longing in her heart for a normal life. A bead of sweat rolled down Edelgard's forehead as she whirled around in an attempt to catch her opponent off guard. But her pose remained relaxed as she moved the shaft of her training axe upwards to catch a blow, her expression still blank. She did not sweat from exertion, but rather the sunlight beating down on her from above on the perfectly trimmed lawns. Her opponent's white dress shirt was slick with sweat in comparison as the edge of his plastic sword danced around in arcs of silver. His face curled into a grimace as he parried one of her weaker blows before retaliating with a tap to her torso. "You're holding back," Felix pointed out. His expression was that of barely hidden irritation, still glaring at her even as she lowered her weapon in mock disappointment. "I'm out of practice," Edelgard lied. "Sorry to disappoint you." She had promised the younger Frildarius a spar the next time she visited the Frildarius estate. Which was to say, it was her first time visiting the estate, and it certainly put Glenn and Ingrid's penthouse to shame. Built in the old Faergus style, ornate columns dotted the rotunda overlooking the house. Calling it a house was a mild understatement. It was more of a mansion, spread out amongst the vast greenery and forest surrounding it. It almost reminded her of the villa of her youth, save for the fact that it was about 3 times the size and probably 3 times as expensive. Stucco on the outside covered walls made of solid brick, gleaming white beneath the glare of the afternoon sun. Beautifully trimmed hedges and blooming flowers adorned the path leading from their makeshift training area back to the main house. And, of course, she was quite aware of the security. Frildarius Securities was probably the most difficult of all security systems to crack, and she guessed that all the stops had been pulled out for the Frildarius estate. A keen eye could spot laser grids, rotating security cameras embedded in impossible positions, and a full biometric scanner on each entrance. She supposed that she was about as safe as she could be here, though as the Queen of Flames she disliked just how airtight the security was. A flash of white and she was forced back on the defensive. Felix was fast, but he favored his right far too much to be an effective opponent. While Edelgard could praise his footwork and technique, he fought with no regard to his own safety and pushed the offensive far too much. It was easy, she thought, to simply strike him on his left with enough force to break her axe. But she would not, and thus could not, and so she remained in a constant cycle of defensive footwork. She had always been gifted when it came to single combat. Even as a child she could give the aging axe knights a run for their money, and Edelgard had no difficulty with opponents of her own age. It was a trifle to see the openings, to analyze her opponents on a psychological and physical level and use it to extract an advantage. But though her heart yearned for the exhilarating feeling of winning a friendly spar, she knew there was no joy to be had fighting a normal opponent anymore. The magistrate had turned her into a monster the likes of which could only be matched by some of the other monsters lurking within the bowels of the Empire. Her spar with Felix only served to irritate her further. "Frildarius," she yelled out. "You're overextended." Edelgard's words, of course, fell on deaf ears. She smoothed out the crease in her forehead with her hand, cursing the little upstart and his propensity to ignore orders. He always had a problem with authority, whether it was hers, or Manuela's, or even the crown prince's. Perhaps it was simply in his nature. That isn't quite accurate, she thought, correcting herself. His brother had been the head of the Blue Lions a few years back, and even now some of the faculty still talked about the records he set. By all accounts he had been nothing but loyal all the way to the very end. So why was Felix so rebellious? She supposed that it was a classic case of survivor's guilt. As if on cue, several blunt arrows whizzed past Felix from the tree as two brawlers charged forward. Raphael and Caspar, perhaps the worst duo to run into at Garreg Mach, considering their level of coordination with one another. Raphael was the strongest out of all the students, and though Caspar was a bit smaller, to his chagrin, he had a surprising amount of agility and thus covered for the former's weaknesses. Felix was a remarkable swordsman, however. He managed to hold his own for a decent amount of time as Edelgard slowly approached forward, arrows clanking against her wooden shield. His wooden sword clanked against their gauntlets, stabbing and dancing around them as they tried to latch onto Felix and pin him to the ground. But it was too difficult to get a hold of him without being stabbed, so Raphael drew his attention while Caspar moved around for the flank. It was the professor's idea to have teams of 3 fight it out to the last team standing. And of course, to promote inter-house bonding, she decided to assign one representative from the Lions, Deers, and Eagles each to every team. The stakes were equally as frivolous as the entire competition, a skip day for class, provided that they reviewed the notes at a later date. There were those who jumped at the thought Sylvain and Hilda, paired together along with the quite miffed Petra, were practically salivating at the idea of being able to miss class. They occasionally skipped class together, that is, until Hanneman started to drag them in by the ears into the classroom. And then there was her team. Felix cared only about getting stronger. It was a noble pursuit, but he often did so without any regard for authority. And Edelgard? She would do anything if it meant achieving her goals, even if it meant putting up with the frivolity of lecture and taking notes. She had always admonished him for favoring his right. And as Caspar landed a solid blow to his side and he nearly keeled over in pain, Edelgard began to shout. Lysithea! The young girl hidden in the tree raised her hands, creating an incantation of dark magic that swirled around her in perfectly geometric patterns. The light shot upwards as Felix became enveloped in it, a circular shape mixed with a hexagon that enveloped his body in a purple light. Oh, no, you don't dash! Raphael charged and Caspar punched, though they only hit each other in confusion. Felix reappeared right next to Lysithea, light dissipating from around him. Edelgard could only barely make out a barrage of insults and curses before she yelled at the both of them to move for cover. As if on cue, wooden arrows sprouted from behind a tree and toward where they had just been standing had they not moved. Felix yanked the girl's arm, and she could have sworn that something cracked. She was pale and fragile, and her platinum-purple hair fluttered in the wind as she yelped in pain. She snarled something snarky in return, and Felix let out a frustrated yell before the entire tree lit ablaze. Felix, Lysithea, dead, the professor yelled over the din of carnage. Now go join all the other dead people. Edelgard's frustration was palpable. And as she charged into combat to fight a losing battle, coming up against Raphael and Caspar, she began to see why recruiting Felix would never work. It was a plan that she had drafted with Hubert on paper. He seemed a suitable candidate for the cause. Perhaps the most skilled swordsman of his age, with an absolutely ruthless killer instinct matched only perhaps by the vassal princess of Brigid herself. But he would never be a suitable candidate, not when he still harbored feelings for the Frildarius family and the throne that his father protected. Even if he took up arms against his own people, it would be out of spite and bitterness, which was a poor combination for someone who needed to be obedient. Obedient to her. Her empire. His hubris would get the better of him one day. A proud knight usually was the first to die. But if the younger Frildarius ever let go of the animosity he held toward Dmitri, the boar, then they would be no doubt one of the strongest pair of warriors on the continent. Edelgard would be a fool to let them do so. So as she absent-mindedly swatted away the brawlers with her heavy armor, using the edge of her shield as a makeshift battering ram, she began to draft plans to divide the prince and his childhood friend further and further. Enough, said a voice. She recognized it dimly from the recesses of her mind as she and Felix dropped their weapons. Edelgard followed where the voice had come from, a soft but stern one, and stumbled Glenn. She corrected herself as soon as she had a closer look. Glenn had a crew cut probably so he could more easily fit his head into a helmet. Felix had his hair neatly tied up in a ponytail behind him, with loose strands hanging above his forehead. But this man he let his dark blue hair cascade down the sides of his face in waves, framing a grizzled face with the hints of a beard growing. It was unmistakably the same piercing cobalt eyes that all Frildarius men seemingly had, just a bit more weary. Edelgard struggled to place the man in her mind. I've seen this man before. The stern features, and she was beginning to wonder if all Frildarius's were copy-pasted from a template, gave way to a softer smile, as he began to walk toward her. Though he was immaculately dressed in a three-piece black suit, his gait was relaxed and more akin to an embarrassed dad trying to cover for his son. She simply stood there, trying not to let her jaw go slack as she tried to piece together why a wave of nostalgia was hitting her at the moment. He extended a gloved hand to Edelgard. I am Rodrigue, he said warmly. I've heard a lot about you, Edelgard. She shook it, but her gut told her that something was off. He's hiding something, she realized. His handshake was hesitant while hers remained firm, which meant that there was something wrong that she didn't know, and that was the worst possible feeling. Don't panic. That's funny, she replied. I haven't heard anything about you at all yet from Glenn or Ingrid. He sheepishly put his hand behind his neck in embarrassment. Kids, he muttered. Always forgetting about their dear old dad. You know I'm Felix's dad too, right? Yes, she knows, groaned Felix, still clutching his plastic sword. Can we get back to sparring, father? I have some techniques I want to try out. Well, it's rude if I don't greet our guest first, he said, chuckling. I hear from Ingrid that you're pretty good with the axe. No doubt you've been giving my son a run for his money. She's much better with the lance than I am with the axe, Edelgard replied neutrally. A hint of a wry smile formed on Rodrigue's lips. Ingrid is a Solar Games champion. She's better than all of us. I couldn't be more of a proud father. There was a reminder in the back of her head that Ingrid had been better. It was her fault that her best friend was in this state, that she might never be able to do what she enjoyed ever again. The feeling of guilt remained overwhelming at times, and it took all of Edelgard's will to drag her back into the present. Don't sell yourself short. She wouldn't be where she is today without a good sparring partner like you, Rodrigue continued. Though, say you wouldn't mind going for a spar with this old man, would you? She was at a loss for words. This jokey, unassuming dad figure was the head of Frildarius Securities, responsible for half of the trouble her Black Eagles faced every time they broke into a building. She supposed that it made sense. Glenn seemed like a reasonable human being, and someone had to support Ingrid. And though Rodrigue Frildarius's demeanor irritated her a bit, it reminded her of how it felt to have a father that cared. Dad, Felix interrupted, annoyed. What? It's bad manners to take my sparring partner. Well, isn't the point of taking partners to switch sometimes? Like a rowdy teenager, he rolled his eyes. The kid was in college. He should have grown out of his rebellious phase by now. But it appeared that both in her false memories and in the current reality, it seemed as if Felix Frildarius would always have a problem with authority. It was a trait that they both shared, just not as openly. Fine. He properly sheathed his sword in an exaggerated manner, looking directly at Edelgard with a small frown. We'll fight another time, Edelgard. And this time, no holding back. I wasn't holding back, she complained, or at least did her best impression of a childish pout. But I'll hold you to that. The younger son nodded before stomping off in a hurry, leaving only Edelgard and the apparent patriarch of the Frildarius household alone. There was a small frown on Rodrigue's face, before he took off his blazer and grabbed a plastic sword from the rack. Felix's had been relatively worn, but this one was brand new. He probably didn't spar as frequently as his obsessed son. She should have done a better job looking up the Frildarius family. It was a thought that only occurred to her because she had absolutely nothing to talk about with this Rodrigue. And yet she knew she had to have seen him somewhere before, and it certainly was not in the jumble of memories from another world that swirled in her brain. If only she had dug deeper. I do apologize for my son's conduct, Rodrigue said, shaking his head. Perhaps I shouldn't have been so lenient. It's fine, she replied, taking up her axe and switching into the standard two-armed stance. I was a rowdy teenager once as well. A lie. She had never been a teenager. She had been an adolescent, and then grew up promptly after the death of her family. She wondered what it was like to grow up as a Frildarius. I suppose he'll grow out of it eventually, he mused. But enough chatter. Edelgard. She rolled her eyes. It seemed that theatrics and swordplay ran in the bloodline. It was soon apparent to her that they had their own distinct styles. While she had never sparred with Glenn, her first fight with him was a textbook engagement between sword and axe, using superior dexterity to try to outmaneuver her brute strength but without doing anything too out of the ordinary. He fought like a soldier, while his younger brother was far more aggressive. He fought with reckless abandonment, focusing more on advanced techniques and pushing his advantage rather than fighting over every small glancing blow Edelgard landed. And then there was Rodrigue. He had a little bit of both, an aggressive tendency to push forward, but with the careful restraint of a soldier. Then there were the stranger techniques he used, which included but were not limited to sweeps and kicks. What the dash? Her shin caught a bit of his foot, and Rodrigue laughed. Sorry. We didn't ban kicking, did we? Not banning something is not the same as no holds barred, she complained. That's how you get your leg chopped off. Ah, it's fine, he replied nonchalantly. I'll just get a metal one if that happens. Edelgard moved forward, taking advantage of his unsteady footing to deliver a solid strike. But he blocked it right above his torso, and so the dance continued for a bit longer. For a man of his age, which she guessed was somewhere around the late 40s to early 50s, he was rather quick. Though his strength paled in comparison to Felix's or Glenn's, he more than made up for it in technique. She could not pick out any flaws in his swordplay aside from the fact that he kicked far too often, delivering sweeping blows that were often left unanswered. She was tempted to smash it with her axe, but that was a bit too much for Edelgard Eisner. There was a moment of opportunity where Rodrigue left his guard a bit too far down, and so she took the opportunity to deliver a series of smashing blows that rained down from above. He blocked 3 of them, but the last one managed to clip him in the shoulder, and if it was real combat, it would have shattered his collarbone to bits. You mix the old Faergus style with the Nuevo Adrestian one, he muttered, wincing slightly as he backed up a few paces. Where'd you learn? I had a good instructor. Huh. Your father taught you, then? My father passed away a long time ago, she replied somberly. I see. Though I suppose Lambert was always better with the spear, he mused. Perhaps it was Gustav that taught you. Her blood ran cold. Prickly icicles pressed into her heart as her throat constricted. Panic began to set in. Lambert? Edelgard resisted the urge to grab her host by the throat and strangle the information out of him. That was her father's name, information that less than a handful of people in the solar system knew. If the patriarch of the Frildarius family knew, then... Who's Lambert? She asked, trying to play the ditzy socialite. She had been good at wearing a mask, but something told her it was a futile effort. Edelgard von Hresvelg, Rodrigue said with the finality of any magistrate judge. But his features were soft. Was it pity? I may look like an overbearing father, but I am no fool. It took me until today to put together all the pieces of the puzzle. Her mind raced with possibilities. Who had sold her out? Had she accidentally revealed too much from her sparring? No, she had not done anything too out of the ordinary, if else, she had been more careful than usual. But there was clearly something he knew that she did not, and it made her blood boil. If she could get away with killing Rodrigue Frildarius without anyone noticing, if she could make it look like an accident, and assuming none were privy to the information in his mind, then it was very much possible to get away with it unless... There was no point in beating around the bush. He knows. And I may have to choose between a normal life and revenge. Then you know why this matters to me. Are you going to sell me out, Mr. Frildarius? She asked, frost creeping into her tone. Edelgard reasoned that she could salvage it. A strongly negative reaction incited discomfort in the question asker, and painting herself as a victim of repressed trauma could work. All she had to do was keep her composure. He'll ask for something in return for his silence. That was how transactional relationships worked, and she was no stranger to those. I'm not quite following. If you know who I am, then you must want something. Rodrigue stood there, before looking over both shoulders to make sure no one was eavesdropping. His shirt was slick with sweat, and he slowly sheathed his sword before pressing 2 fingers to his temple. Edelgard instinctively shifted stances, though she was unsure if it was to fight or to flee. I think you're mistaken, he sighed. Deactivate recording systems in Sector 3 of the yard. She heard something click distantly as she simply stood there in confusion. You don't know, Rodrigue said sadly. Know what? Of course. Anselma had always insisted on keeping her daughter away from the affairs of the old Faergus bloodlines until she was 18. You're not making sense, Edelgard interrupted. Who are you? And how do you know Dash? I would never sell you out. Oh, Lambert. I was your father's best man at the wedding. Edelgard von Hresvelg recalled the day that her parents got married. Her birth father's marriage was not something she could be there for, but she was there when her mother fell in love again. It was not something that Edelgard understood, yet love was a complex affair that she always read about in books, and yet she had yet to experience. It would have been much more difficult to come to terms with having a new father, had it not been for the presence of her step-brother. As she spread crimson petals on the small cobble road leading to the garden in Lambert's villa, he was not paw to her just yet, scattering them to the wind. She carefully watched the woman behind her as she walked down the aisle. Anselma von Hresvelg, soon to be Bladded, walked down the aisle draped in white elegance. Light brown hair fell past her shoulders, covered in a beautiful lace bridal train that followed behind her as she walked with grace and solemnity. But her face told the true story. Her lavender eyes shone with happiness, her lips curled into a smile that radiated throughout the entire garden. It was a smile that Edelgard would try to emulate for the rest of her life, to no avail, of course. Edelgard shared a glance with her brother, sitting in the front and content with snacking on a small lollipop. His small features showed only one expression in the moment: content. Though he was still too young to comprehend the importance of such an occasion, his bright blue eyes shone with happiness, and it was enough to make her smile. Once her mother was done walking up the aisle, she curtsied in her muted red dress and took a seat next to her brother. He whispered mischievously. You have petals on your dress. Oh. She shook them off and hoped no one noticed. Red on red, she got lucky this time. Her stepfather stood at the altar, and he, too, was beaming. For once his hair was perfectly combed, the blonde no longer sticking out at strange angles, and his 3-piece tuxedo was absolutely immaculate. But she remembered the smile most of all, and she realized that it was the exact same as her mother's. People talked. It was a small affair, with no more than a couple dozen people in attendance. There were some of the Inver elite. The Agirs and Vestras were here, and Hubert was sitting right behind her, no doubt keeping a careful eye on his ward. Her uncle was here, as was his wife, and a few other relatives she barely recognized. And then there was a family that she didn't recognize, dark blue hair with minor scowls on their face. They were scary. Dida was sitting right next to Hubert, which was a lot funnier in the moment than in the moment. No doubt they were probably bickering in hushed whispers, though she knew that if anyone gave Dida strange looks for being a man of Dusker, Hubert would probably jab them in the solar plexus with his bony elbow. She wasn't paying much attention to the actual ceremony, which was more of a formality than anything. There was a priest in attendance, dressed in a suit with the emblem of Faergus on it. Mother had never been much of a religious woman, but she knew her father adhered to Faergus traditions more out of obligation than out of belief. He spoke rites about the goddess, and verses from a book that she had never read. Will the best man please rise? The head of the family she didn't quite recognize rose from his seat, and she remembered thinking his blue hair was a bit too long for his face. He cleared his throat, looking directly at Lambert, and began. I was going to read off cue cards, he said, but I know Lambert would probably kill me. So this is off the top. There were a couple chuckles in the crowd, and Lambert looked like he was about to die of embarrassment. Lambert has been there for me through my entire life. He is, without a doubt, the best friend I could ever ask for. Even if he has terrible taste in alcohol, and refuses to ever go see a movie with me, and he can't drive worth a damn. Now the audience was laughing a bit more, and Edelgard had to bite her lip to not join in. Dima giggled. I still remember the day I introduced you to Anselma. She is a wonderful lady, and the moment I saw you two hold hands for the first time I knew that things would turn out all right. And they've been better than all right from what Lambert tells me, they've been nothing but bliss. For a while, I feared that my best friend would never love again. I prayed to the goddess that one day I might be able to give another speech as your best man, Lambert, and it seems that day has finally come. The man smiled. I will always be here for the two of you. Just as you were for me, all those years ago. I cannot put into words just how happy I am to see you, thriving and smiling, and I hope that these peaceful days will never end. To Anselma and Dmitri. He took his seat, and the applause was deafening. Her mother was smiling, her eyes slightly wet, and her father was grinning even though his face was mildly red. It would take Edelgard years for those words to finally set in, bits and pieces of the happiness she shared with her family slowly coming back to her as the years passed. And it was bittersweet. She did not know what she had until she had lost it all. And now those memories came bubbling up once more, and now she truly understood who Rodrigue Frildarius was. You were the one who gave the speech, she finished. That was the only time I ever saw you, Rodrigue said. Your brother, I knew well, but I remembered that you had the same piercing eyes as your mother, and now you are a spitting image of Anselma. You're Rod, Edelgard realized, dumbfounded. Rod, short for Roddy Rodrigue, he replied, smiling. She had never felt so out of place in the Frildarius estate, a relic of the past that was rusty with gore and sorrow. It had taken years for her to confront her past, to bury them deep down until she could go to sleep without crying. And now came the unexpected clashing of two parts of her life that she hoped would never meet, the past and present colliding. She hadn't made the connection between the Rod that her father would always talk of, and the father-in-law of her best friend. Edelgard von Hresvelg had been a fool. And now her true identity was in danger. Chapter 45, A Perfect Tea Time. 16 years ago Hresvelg family falls. 12 years ago Dodden-Brigid War breaks out. 2 years later, the Novelli family falls. 9 years ago Lambert died. Bladdid family falls. 7 years ago Almiron War breaks out. 1 year later, the Regan family falls. 2 months ago Lonato Gaspard's rebellion is crushed. I cannot in good conscience see these events as unrelated. The empire turning their outer colonies into subjugated states of fear. The great noble houses being picked off, one by one. The pattern is obvious, and if the pattern holds, we will be next. I must take precautions. I cannot openly move against the magistrate, that would be suicidal folly. But I must ensure the safety of my family at all costs, even if it means sacrificing my own life. But how to do so? Lambert's consolidation of his forces made him a target. And I am not one of those accursed nobles, using mercenaries and private military companies to do their dirty work. I will not have my hands stained with blood like them. What kind of a man would I be? Lisha would never forgive me. I can do a little digging. Slowly, in ways that will never be detected. I am responsible for the security of some of the magistrate's most guarded servers, but like a fool, we have made them without a backdoor. Any tampering I do will be tracked, and then I will be hung and executed. No, I will do it through my connections. Through the vast network I have cultivated from my time as an officer and as an executive, I will have my eyes and ears in the most sparse of places. I will do what I must, because it is what Lambert would have wanted. I failed Lambert. I should have known, put together the pieces, discovered a conspiracy long before death had time to take him. And yet I did not, and for that I must atone. But I will not fail the Frildarius name as well. From the private notes of Rodrigue Frildarius. I didn't think Rodrigue Akil Frildarius would drink tea, Edelgard said, sipping the perfectly made blend of Almiron pine needle tea from an elaborate porcelain cup. She checked the engravings, and sure enough, it had the family crest of Frildarius. It almost looked like an ornate shield of sorts, carved in blue lines that she could touch with her pinky finger that slightly jutted from the porcelain. What did you expect? I don't know, she shrugged. Smoothies, energy drinks, whiskey, that seems like what an executive would drink. Everybody should drink tea, he replied without missing a beat. It's good for the soul. Tea lacks the, well, to put it crudely, the oomph necessary in a drink. You sound just like your stepfather, he snorted. He'd drink a glass of Fairgus whiskey whenever we had our little tea times. Tea is too relaxed, he said in a lilting imitation of her father's voice. I need something stronger. Rodrigue's office was an absolute mess by any standards. There were stacks of papers scattered across the floor and desk, surrounding the swivel chair that he sat in. Behind him, rows and rows of books were arranged neatly in bookshelves, though from the spines she could see that none of them were worn enough to be read thoroughly. Placed between the bookshelves were server consoles occasionally pulsing with the shimmer of red light. On his desk were several hollow screens, which were blanked as a courtesy to his guest. I suppose Pa was the rowdy one and you were the calm one. Rodrigue chuckled at that. No, quite the opposite, in fact. Though he had his fair share of drunken hysterics in his day, he certainly sobered up as soon as he took on the responsibility of leading the Bladded family. I can't quite say the same, unfortunately. But a drink or two of whiskey after a long day of work, well, that was fine for him. It bothers me that I never got to ask him about, Edelgard paused. Well, anything, really. By the time I worked up the courage to ask him, it was too late. I'm happy to answer what I can in his place. His brow furrowed. But I have some questions of my own. She raised an eyebrow. Sure. I'd like to know how it all happened. Especially Lambert. Just how did Dash? Edelgard sighed. She had hoped to flip the tables on her interrogator and get more information out of him, but it seemed that Rodrigue was able to see through her ploys with ease. It only made sense, after all her dearly departed stepfather was the one who taught her most of her tricks, and his best friend probably had been through it already. It certainly didn't help that her emotions were running rampant, a mixture of nostalgia, fear, and sadness, and it threatened to bubble to the surface if she didn't actively keep it bottled up in the iron vault that was her heart. I told you, she sighed. I was the only survivor. I watched him die in front of me. I don't know what else I can say. Her frustration was beginning to leak out through her words, partly for being put on the spot, and partly because she simply didn't want to dredge up those memories. And little Dmitri. Her blood ran ice cold, and she remained silent. My apologies. I'm sorry for prying, he said with a somber expression. But you're perhaps the first person I've talked to who can tell me the truth, the real truth, not just what the world wants me to hear. I can't help but ask. The truth. Edelgard laughed, bitterness creeping through her hollow tone. I barely even know the truth. All I know is that I'm the only one left, and now all I want in my life is to start over. Start over. I don't understand how you haven't been found yet, mused Rodrigue. It's not as if you're hiding. You picked a fake last name, sure, but you're still using your first name, for crying out loud. How many Edelgards Dash? There are 193 registered in the Newfoundland database, she replied without missing a beat. And how many Edelgards actively take part in high society? Never mind that, how many were registered as axe duelists? 12, and 4 of them. I've met all of them, actually, she replied with a hint of snark leaking through. She had done her research, no point in hiding it. 4 is still cutting it far too close, he muttered, shaking his head. If I wanted to hide, I'd change my name and move to Morphies, so that no one could find me. Hiding in plain sight is much more effective, Edelgard stated, taking a sip of her steaming hot tea. It's not as if anyone is looking for me. Even you didn't. If I knew you were alive, then I would have looked. But you didn't. No, Rodrigue admitted. There was no evidence of your survival. In fact, it's sheer coincidence we met today. I had hoped it was you after Glenn started babbling about an Edelgard with enhancements, but the odds were still far too low. If the magistrate is that certain you are completely dead, then how did you even survive? Don't remember. She tried to keep a straight face, but her lip quivered despite her best efforts. It's not something I wish to talk about. I see, he mused. I won't press you on it, but at least answer this. Go ahead. Did the Duskurites do it? She paused for a single second. No. And you know that. He leaned forward, as to ascertain whether she was lying or not. You know that absolutely, 100%, for sure. Yes. Rodrigue leaned back into his chair, letting out the breath that he had been holding for several seconds. I wish I could say I was surprised. Everything just didn't add up. Lambert taking the offer to go to Dusker and do business, and Anselma ready to pack up her life and her kids to go with him. It reeked of a trap, and I'm not dumb enough to believe what they say about men of Dusker. Neither am I. It's not that easy to refuse the magistrate, when they give you an offer like that, Edelgard replied. Though I didn't really know what was going on at the time, it just seemed too good to be true. You don't just get offered to do business with a planet. And yet I still don't know for sure why it had to be him, of all people. Why did they dash? Now it was Edelgard's turn to shake her head. I don't know for sure. I wish I did. If you'll indulge me, I have two possible theories, Rodrigue explained. One is that he pissed off the wrong people. Perhaps it was the Hresvelgs for obvious reasons. I doubt my blood father would have enough pull to do something like that anymore. Not when he's rotting in jail, she added. Point. Or perhaps it was the Kleinmans, the Matthiases, or the Akrons dash. It'd have to be a coordinated effort, Edelgard guessed. It wouldn't just be one family. I see that you've given it a bit of thought, Edelgard. But yes. Anselma married quite well. It would take a lot to bring the Bladdid family down. And it certainly did. I've had 8 years to wallow in my own misery, she said bitterly. Of course I've thought about it. I thought about why, about if there were signs that I should have seen coming, if my father knew and couldn't do anything about it. Which brings us to the second possibility, and it's a good thing these walls are completely soundproof and swept for bugs. The more obvious one, she guessed. Yes. The magistrate. Edelgard did not even blink at that statement. She had simply assumed it was true that the Bladdid conglomerate was simply too powerful, that of course the magistrate and by extension the God Emperor would see him as someone to be feared. It was the most obvious explanation if Dusker was truly not responsible for his death, which was something she was absolutely sure of. That's dangerous territory you're heading into, she said with a fake low tone. What if dash? I would be naive to not consider it a possibility, Rodrigue countered. Especially considering how close I was with your father, and how our families started in the first place. Then again, I suppose both possibilities could be true, she said quietly. The other families might have conspired with the higher UPS in the Empire to destroy us. Oh, absolutely, Rodrigue replied. Would you like to see my research, Edelgard? Research? After a few seconds of awkward silence, Rodrigue turned around to rummage through several stacks of paper, with a few sheets comically flying into the air and being carried away by the air vent wind. He swore under his breath before he tensed up, grabbing a wooden board with several pieces of paper pinned to it. It was about as large as she was, and so he carefully slid it out from beneath the stack and into his hands. Edelgard simply sat there and sipped her tea, still bewildered at the whole concept of Rodrigue as a person. He placed it flat on the table, clearing away some pencils, still uses, and a random assortment of documents that clattered onto the floor. Red strings wrapped around pushpins, both securing the papers that were attached to the board and serving as markers. There were images, names, and even financial reports attached. Edelgard was struggling to keep track of it all. There were names she recognized, and some that she did not. The only thing that it confirmed was that Rodrigue Frildarius was unquestionably crazy. The Arundels, she read. You suspected my uncle. There were memories of sweet summer days with her uncle and cousins, watching as they ran around the Hresvelg villa with her, and eventually at the Bladdid villa. Volkhard von Arundel had been a caring father and a good brother. She knew that it was him that her mother talked to when she needed to vent. But his appearances became less and less frequent as she grew older, until one day she couldn't recall the last time she had seen her uncle. No, Rodrigue said. Give me some time to explain my theory. He gestured to the board below him, towering above it and by extension her. She simply remained still, sipping her tea and letting her eyes do the wandering. Go for it. Volkhard was a good man. I knew him when he was in college, which is part of the reason why your stepfather met your mother. But he hasn't been seen in years. He made a public appearance right after the tragedy of Dusker, and then that was it. No one has seen or heard from him since, and his finances have since passed over to his children. I know, Edelgard replied bitterly. My guess is that he struck some sort of bargain to protect my cousins. Is that why you didn't go to them for help? Rodrigue asked. I had forgotten about your mother's side of the family. It would only put them in more danger. She thought of Heidi and Burkhart, and of Selin and little Hedwig. She was right in the middle of them age-wise, and she could have probably lived a happier life with them taking her in. But they had been left fatherless by the whole incident, and from what she remembered, Miss Arundel had not been a pleasant woman by any standards. Her mother practically cursed her name each time she was brought up. Which leads us to the timing of the whole incident. His finger traced the red line back to the center, containing a portrait image of what had to be Rodrigue and Lambert as teenagers. This splintered into 3 other red lines pointing to images, and she recognized 2 of them as heads of their respective families. There was Yvonne von Novelli, and she winced at the memory of her daughter and the accursed incident under Mount Gaspard. There was her own father Ionius von Hresvelg before his hair had withered to grey and wrinkles began to overtake whatever youthful good looks he had. Then there was a man she didn't recognize, hawkish features shrouding a pair of viridian eyes, with a jawline that could cut through steel. He looked awfully familiar, and she wondered if he had been related to someone she knew well. In the last 2 decades, Rodrigue continued, 4 of the strongest noble families and their subsidiary companies have been all but annihilated. Each of them was due to off-world attacks, often assumed to be perpetrated by the colonies and their natives. I recognize the first 2, Edelgard asked. But who's the last one? Charles von Regen. Oh. Of course. I know a Regen, she said, careful not to reveal too much. Ingrid and I went to university with him. Ah, yes. The Regen boy, what was his name dash? I don't remember. But from what I could tell, she added, he didn't seem too stuck up. If I hadn't known his last name, I wouldn't have pegged him as a scion of a noble family. Because the Regens were no longer a noble family at that point. They were the old guard of Leicester, or what was formerly known as United Leicester, until Charles von Regen and his daughter moved to Almira. And you think there's a connection to what happened to my stepfather? Perhaps indirectly, he suggested. The circumstances are a bit different from what I understand. He was already firmly entrenched in Almiran business when the Almiran War broke out. Weapons, agriculture. Your father did a great deal of business with him before the war, and even during. And then the war must have obliterated the House of Regen, leaving only an upstart son, Edelgard muttered. No wonder why he's like that. Like what? Nothing. She cleared her throat. She was loath to admit that Claude and her were far more alike than she realized, and it was not a conversation either were going to have any time soon. There was still resentment from their brief tryst during college, and even more so after their interactions as fellow mercenaries. But he must have started the Golden Deer for a reason. Perhaps it was to reclaim the Regen name, or perhaps it was to strike back at the Empire. Either way, there was more reason to keep him at arm's length. Claude was in many ways her equal, and perhaps a better manipulator than her. Anyways, he said, returning to the board. The Almiran War destroyed his family. Now the Gonrils are stewards of the planet, so they've essentially usurped the title of Leicester's premier family. Hilda Valentine Gonril. She knew exactly who Hilda was from the moment they became sparring partners, but there had to be a reason why she was now running with the Golden Deer instead of colonizing like the rest of her family. There was something about her that was off. Perhaps it was the vapid pillow princess act she put on, while simultaneously being able to destroy battalions with an axe the size of her. But the war was after the tragedy, Edelgard pointed out. How could it have been a possible cause if it was several years after? I'm not finished yet, Rodrigue said, tutaying his tongue. She sighed in exasperation, as if she was being lectured by yet another professor. Which brings us to the Novelli family. I know what happened. Destroyed, Edelgard finished. Dodden separatists blew up their space station in a suicide attack, wiping out the whole family. Well, save for one. And now you see the pattern here, right? Edelgard's face paled as she realized the full gravity of Rodrigue's statement. Part of her refused to believe it. That it was a mere coincidence, that they were completely unrelated events and that this was merely the crazed ramblings of a man stricken with grief. Perhaps Edelgard wished that she was destined to be the Queen of Flames, that she was the only one in New Fodlan craving revenge for her dearly departed family. But even she wasn't delusional enough to believe that she was special. No doubt the magistrate and by extension the Empire had left many orphans in their pursuit of order. She was only one of many. She should have admitted that when she fought Constance von Novelli. And if the Empire was truly destroying the system of nobility, was that a good thing? I take it from your dour expression that you're not sure how to feel about it, Rodrigue guessed. I understand. I know the old nobility's been bleeding New Fodlan dry for years. I would know. She thought of her father, who was probably still rotting in prison, if he was even still alive. Tried for charges of corruption, bribery, racketeering, conspiracy against the Empire. It was a laundry list of crimes for an 8-year-old to stomach. Whenever Edelgard asked her mother, she simply dodged the question and stroked her hair in a soothing manner. And even as an adult, the more she looked into it, the more she knew her father was guilty of all those crimes. Rodrigue winced in sympathy. Yes. I'm not very close with the old Adrestian families, minus your mother, but even I knew that the trial of Ionius IX was absolutely unprecedented. Did my mother talk about it? No. Only your uncle and your stepfather knew, most likely, and I suspect they took it to the grave. Edelgard balled her fist in frustration underneath the table. No matter how much she didn't want to delve in her past, deep down she wanted to know. She wanted to know everything about why the Hresvelg family collapsed, why her father did what he did, how her mother was able to move on. But she could not recall most of her memories as a child. She remembered her father only as a photograph, cold and distant while her mother raised her. It was impossible for her to say that she loved him or that he loved her in return. Edelgard simply did not know. And not knowing things ate at the very core of her existence. So the Hresvelgs were the first to fall, she said after a moment. The first of many. Those were only the major ones, Rodrigue added. I haven't even mentioned the Ordlias, the Arundels, the Karens, the Vestras, hell, even the Akrons dash. That was more recent. And from what I understand, Edelgard replied, recalling the incident at Conand district, Governor Akiran deserved everything that came to him. There wasn't much talk about him anymore, but the little that she did hear suggested the magistrate locked him in prison and pretty much threw away the key. No doubt he had been scapegoated for far more crimes than that, though he deserved worse. There were others who knew and deserved the same. She would have to find out who. And it is indicative of a larger problem. The aristocracy is getting desperate. They fear the new aristocracy, the CEOs, the socialites, the celebrities of New Fodlan. Old money is starting to die out, and it's not a surprise they've turned to corruption and bribery to get their way. The God Emperor would be blind not to see that. And you think the God Emperor's trying to clean that up? She asked mockingly. I doubt he cares about making systemic change, not when his empire still runs smoothly. No, the God Emperor, Rodrigue paused, as if choosing his words carefully not commit treason. No doubt he has a part to play in it, but he must have an ulterior motive in mind, something far above even my pay grade. And we'd never know, because it's the God Emperor, Edelgard muttered. Exactly. He looked over his shoulders, as if to check if anyone was watching through the tinted windows. Perhaps she was naive to believe she was safe here, with Rodrigue, but she was probably far safer here than in the tunnels of Abyss or even in the outskirts of New Fodlan. Those with principles tended to be far more straightforward and as a result, far too easily manipulated. No, it'd be far easier to figure out what the motives of the magistrate are. I suspect it's a play on both the magistrate's part and by the other noble families. And the next largest noble families are Dash. House Agir, House Goneril, Rodrigue said, before pausing. And House Frildarius. Edelgard sighed. We wouldn't be having this conversation if I suspected you of anything. He chuckled. Don't be naive, take it from the guy who runs a security company. I know that you don't fully trust me yet, even if I was close with Lambert. The only thing I can do is give you reasons to trust in me. Agreed, Edelgard said dryly. Left unsaid was the implication that it was naive to trust Edelgard as well, though hopefully Rodrigue did not suspect anything just yet. Let's get back on track, Rodrigue said, checking the time on his antique watch, which was as expensive as it was gaudy. The Frildarius family is different. Mostly because my great-great-great-grandmother started Frildarius Securities as a way to detach our influence from a noble peerage, and now we're no different than any other corporation. We don't have the same weaknesses as others, what with their shell companies, tax evasion, and whatnot. We lack our own military forces, our own intelligencers. We are merely a noble family in name only. An easy way to say you guys are one of the richest families in Newfoundland, Edelgard pointed out. Everyone knows that. Which is why I have to deal with paparazzi day in and day out, he grumbled. You'd think running a security system would help with that. I see why Ingrid kept her betrothal a secret. No, that's Ingrid being Ingrid, he said with a simple shake of his head. But it worked out, so I can't fault her for it. If you're one of the richest noble families, shouldn't you have enough leverage to ensure your safety as a family? One of the richest, on paper, Rodrigue corrected. Not all of the aristocracy is rotting. I dare you to ask Viceroy Aguirre what his family is worth, and how much they've schemed off the top of Newfoundland. Now that's a family who's both rich and powerful. I'd rather not, considering he knows what I look like. She had prepared a dossier on Ferdinand von Aguirre, and from what she could glean from Flesh being embedded as a spy, he was quite the honorable man. A man of principles. It was no wonder why Hubert and him were seeing one another if the old adage about opposites held. And yet, despite Ludwig von Aguirre being the single most powerful man in Newfoundland, she knew little to nothing about him. The Viceroy was not meant to make public appearances or speak very often. He was meant to carry out the will of the God Emperor. He was too high profile of a target to actively wage a campaign against, which meant she would have to do so through covert means. I suppose he was present at the wedding, but if I were to start digging, I'd start with the Viceroy and his dirty laundry. And what if I don't want to dig? Edelgard replied coolly. You said it yourself, don't be naive. I'd be naive to believe I could change anything by myself, and you'd also be a fool if you wanted to wage war against the magistrate with your resources alone. So why tempt fate? There was a small bit of truth to what she was saying. The Queen of Flames was flesh and blood, and yet even as a symbol she could do nothing but inspire the poor and downtrodden of Newfoundland. Though she did have a fair bit of sympathy in her cold heart for them, Edelgard recognized that throwing bodies at the enemy would not win her the war. No, preparation and allies would, and she was still on the fence about using the power of Frildarius Securities to do so. Rodrigue would prove an invaluable ally and one that she could count on as loyal. And yet she was very cognizant of the fact that if she did lean on Rodrigue's support, she would be roping the entire Frildarius family into the conflict. No matter how well he hid it from the magistrate and the other powers that be, they would know eventually. And she could not in good conscience drag Ingrid into her conflict once more. Not when she still felt guilt in her heart for the Death Knight incident, and that could never be rectified. For the moment, she would have to keep her identity as the Queen of Flames hidden. Even if it was detrimental to her cause, even if she could use the Frildarius family and dispose of them with no real logistical issues at all, Edelgard could not. My damned sentimentality is getting in the way again. So you're just going to give up? Rodrigue said, disappointed. You could find out the truth about Dusker, about the Hresvelgs, about the Empire itself. You're really willing to pass up on that, Edelgard? Edelgard let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, filled with the weariness of a survivor. Perhaps I'd be happier if I put all of this behind me. Rodrigue blinked. Oh. The more I try to escape it, the more I get sucked back into my past. Ingrid, I had hoped that our friendship would be a way to start over, but it seems that fate has other ideas. Do you believe in destiny, Edelgard? She stared blankly at him. I beg your pardon. Not necessarily divine providence, that's more of a Church of the Goddess thing. I mean like fate, that sometimes we're destined to meet certain people in our lives, and we meet them for a reason. I was being metaphorical before. I like to believe I make my own fate, Edelgard replied dryly. But sure, I can see why someone might think that. It's a lot easier if you think someone or some concept is pulling the strings. Makes it a bit easier to stomach. I think I'm somewhere in the middle, Rodrigue admitted. I have never been a devout believer in the faith. But I understand that there are some coincidences that cannot be explained by chance alone, like you meeting Ingrid. If it's not fate, then perhaps it was an inevitability that you'd come into contact with your past again. Some things should stay in the past. I'm not asking you to take up arms against the Empire, if that's what you're asking, Rodrigue said. Who do you take me for, an idiot? Her silence said it all. He scoffed. You and Lambert are so alike in tone, it's almost frightening. I know that bringing up the past is hard. I wasn't even sure how to have this conversation, even after seeing you. You're also the spitting image of your dash. Mother, Edelgard finished with annoyance. You don't have to remind me. Same face, same eyes, same scowl. Except for the white hair. A gift, Edelgard spat. From my torturers. Let's leave it at that, shall we? Rodrigue paused, as if struggling to pick the right words. I understand you want to put it all behind you. I know. I can't even begin to fathom what you've been through. But the only way you'll find closure is not by burying it under another layer of dirt, but by digging it up and finding what lurks underneath. Someday it might not be today, this year, or even this decade you will find it. And when you wish to look, you can come to me. His expression was solemn, and gone was the goofy attitude he had toward Felix and Edelgard when they first met. It was a face of grim determination, one that reminded her of Lambert a bit too much. After a moment of silence, she spoke. Thank you, Rodrigue. Truly. I can see myself searching for the answers eventually. But not now. Not when, Edelgard paused, searching for the right words to say with her curled lips. Not when I still have to atone for what happened to Ingrid. She tried to keep her face as impassive as possible, but it was difficult when her emotions were taking the reins. She hoped that at least part of her mask remained on, the one that refused to open up to others, the one that compartmentalized every little bit of information. It wouldn't do to spill everything through her facial expressions. You didn't give her those injuries, Rodrigue gently reminded her. The Death Knight did. Don't beat yourself up over it. And I could have dash. She stopped herself from saying something that she really shouldn't have said. There was always the thought that she could have done more, subdued him faster, used more lethal techniques, but it would have been the wrong choice in the end for both of them. And though it wasn't the first time she had heard the same sentiments, it was the first time she had begun to truly accept the fact that there was nothing more she could have done that night in Mara. No, Edelgard finished. You're right. There isn't much I can now do but be there for her. And that's why you're here right now, Rodrigue said. You've been a good friend to my daughter-in-law, they've been betrothed to one another for so long I tend to forget sometimes. I know it means so much to her. But I don't want our family history to get in the way of your friendship. It won't, Edelgard said firmly. I'll make sure it doesn't happen. But what about you, Rodrigue? Do you plan to keep searching for the truth, even if it will put you in danger? Yes. I don't think I'll ever stop searching for what happened to my best friend. No, that's not quite right, you know what went down that day. But I still don't know why. I plan on keeping my head down for a while, Rodrigue added. Can't be too careful, these days. But I know where to look, and I know how to look without putting my family in danger. So rest assured. Just be careful, Edelgard finished. I don't want a repeat of Dusker. You know, Rodrigue said, looking out of the window as he shifted the topic of conversation. I've wondered if Newfoundland really would be better off without us. Not just our family, but the rest of the old aristocracy. Relics of a forgotten age, when chivalry mattered and honor was the prevailing code of the day. He rummaged into a cabinet, grabbing a cylindrical object before motioning towards the window. With a smooth motion, it automatically opened wide enough for the breeze to come through. Smoke. He offered her a very expensive-looking cigar. She shook her head. I don't like the smell of smoke. Edelgard lacked the will or the patience to explain why. Fine. I'll smoke out the window. As he lit the cigar and took a long drag, Edelgard finished her tea with one long gulp. By this time it was lukewarm, cold enough to make her insides churn and her taste buds squirm. The light taste of Almira on her tongue was now replaced by a bitter, lingering aftertaste. Once the smoke dissipated and he waved it out the window, Rodrigue finished his train of thought. But then I remember that we're no better than what would come after. Corporations controlled by the magistrate, nothing would change for the common people. It's not our job to decide what's best for the people of Newfoundland, Edelgard gently reminded him. Not from our high horses at least. No. But we can recognize that there is something wrong with it. Edelgard rolled her eyes. You sound like the Queen of Flames. Revolutionary, but with no solution in mind. The window closed shut once more with a wave of his hand, clicking as the airtight seal activated. Sometimes it's enough to know that there is a problem, Rodrigue countered. And now I realize that no matter how corrupt high society is, the magistrate will never be able to solve it if they simply kill all of them. The bloodshed simply can't be worth it. New people will take their place and they may be worse than those originally in power. For that not to happen, it would take a restructuring of the whole system. You want reform, Edelgard realized. And yet it may not happen in my lifetime. But it will come, Rodrigue said. God Emperor or not. All I can do is hope my family survives it, and that they can still be happy. Maybe my grandkids. He stopped, shaking his head like he was unsure of his own words. She admired his ability to at least look toward the future. It was not something she had the luxury of doing. If the time comes when the magistrate comes knocking on your door, she said, I'll stand with you guys. I swear it on the goddess, but let's just hope it never comes to that. It better fucking not, Rodrigue said, before reverting back to a more serious tone. Sorry. Slipped out. I see where my father's habit of swearing like a fighter pilot came from. He shrugged. My etiquette training was sorely lacking. Edelgard laughed, and for once without a hint of bitterness in her tone. I can't say I was pleased when you confronted me on the lawns, but I feel a lot more at ease now after this little tea time. Almost as if I got a piece of my old life back. I'm glad to hear it, Rodrigue replied, giving a warm smile. Let me know if there's anything else I can do for you. I understand that you've been living off the ancestral Hresvelg vaults, haven't you? How do you know that? Edelgard was taken aback by that. Though it wasn't an immediate cause for concern, it meant that she had clearly been doing a poor job of covering her tracks. Though her fortune had been hidden in several shell companies left behind by her birth father, it shouldn't have been that easy to discern. Because I was the executor for Lambert's estate, Rodrigue replied. It's the only way that you could afford to live in high society. Oh. The magistrate took most of it through eminent domain. What wasn't taken was quickly snatched up by other families. I did my best to keep some of it, but the most I managed to keep was the villa. It's not like I can use it, Edelgard sighed. It'd be too suspicious. I assumed you had been, Rodrigue replied. I guess not. You weren't the one leaving the flowers. What flowers? She said, fully knowing exactly what flowers he was referring to. The flowers that Hubert had left, as a memorial to the family he had failed. No, he hadn't quite failed, but he had yet to see the truth behind it. I see, Rodrigue said, rubbing the bit of stubble left on his chin. Then someone else has been paying their respects, someone with access to the security. I wonder who. As long as nothing's missing, Edelgard replied, it should be all right. Doesn't matter who. They have a right to miss our family just as much as we do, and I'm sure they would appreciate the flowers anyway. I thought those gravestones were meant to mark the resting places of the Bladdid family, Rodrigue muttered. But if you're here, then what about the coffins we lowered? Empty, is my guess, Edelgard replied. I doubt the funeral was open casket. Ah. Rodrigue shook his head in sadness. I wish I didn't know that. But still, it serves as a memorial even if it's not a physical one. Perhaps you should visit the grave of your parents, now that you know where it is. She paused for a moment to carefully consider what she could say in the moment. She had been visiting those graves, but she had not been leaving the flowers. Edelgard was lucky that she knew the access codes for the house, along with Bernadetta to scrub the security data. But perhaps it would do to pay a formal visit shrouded in the shadow of darkness yet again, but at least with someone who knew her father as well. She should probably visit with Dudu. But then that would be adding an extra layer of risk to the whole precarious situation, not to mention an apology would be required. In due time, Edelgard said cryptically. I'll be sure to dash. There was a knock on the door. Dad, came a muffled voice from the door. Dinner's ready. Come in, please, Rodrigue replied, swiftly stuffing the wooden board behind him so it wouldn't be visible from the outside. The door creaked open just as Edelgard turned around to reveal Glenn Frildarius himself, dressed in a pink chef's apron over a white dress shirt. His face was slick with sweat, probably from the stove's heat, but there was a wide grin on his face. Hey, Dad. He paused, finding Edelgard's gaze. Oh. That's where you are, Edelgard. Felix said you were sparring him. She nodded as a courtesy. Glenn. I was sparring him, you know. He looked back at the patriarch of House Frildarius. I see you've met my father. Edelgard scoffed at that. Yes. I've been getting interrogated for the last 30 minutes. Interrogation is a harsh word. Dad. Glenn complained, and she saw the similarity between the two Frildarius boys. Don't interrogate our guests. That's my job. But you're off duty, son, Rodrigue replied with a cheeky grin. As head of this house, I take security very seriously. Glenn rolled his eyes. Fine. At least you served her tea, unlike our last visitor. Glenn, it was one time. One time too many, he scoffed. He turned back to Edelgard. I hope he hasn't been asking too many prying questions. My old man tends to be a bit too nosy sometimes. No, she lied. But I'm pretty sure that he's a conspiracy nut. Hey, what? Glenn laughed. All right, all right. I see you two are getting along well enough. I'm going to go pick up Ingrid from the hospital, should be back in 10 minutes. But I expect you to join us at the dinner table then. You can continue your interrogation, then. He put emphasis on the word interrogation, as if it wasn't the first time Rodrigue had been a bit too enthusiastic about asking questions. I do apologize on behalf of my father. One would almost think you're the head of the household, Rodrigue grumbled, with the grumpiness of an annoyed father. But fine. Drive safely, all right. She saw the flicker of a father's pride in his eyes, and for a brief moment Edelgard felt a twinge of jealousy. Irrational, unfounded jealousy for a life that was stolen from her with Lambert and her mother. I will, Dad. Thanks for coming, Edelgard. She smiled in response, and the door shut once more as Glenn began to head out. They waited 30 seconds to speak before Edelgard broke the silence. Please don't tell them. Rodrigue raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to keep secrets from my children. Edelgard shook her head. I'd like to tell them myself. Just not now. We're trying to celebrate Ingrid leaving the hospital. It wouldn't be right to kill the mood. Well, it's a bit late for that, Rodrigue replied. But fine. If you want to tell them yourself, then I'll keep a lid on it for a while. I'm sure Glenn suspects something is amiss with you, but it's not as if he even knows who Edelgard von Hresvelg is. Who's that? She said mockingly. I'm Edelgard Eisner. Eisner, indeed, Rodrigue replied. How'd you even come up with that? She paused, not even knowing where it came from. It was the first thing that popped into my head, I guess. Seemed natural. Strange last name, Rodrigue replied. The Eisners, well, that isn't really a name used outside of the history books. But if it's held up since now, then who am I to question it? Besides, we'll revisit this conversation when the time comes. And I hope, Edelgard added, that perhaps we can shed some light on Dusker then. I knew you couldn't resist, Rodrigue said. Take as much time as you need, Edelgard. For now, I'll keep you in the loop. It occurred to her that perhaps Rodrigue Akil Frildarius did see through her manipulations. He was a shrewd man. Usually her tactics worked on anyone, even those who were close to her. But if her mannerisms were similar to her stepfather's, then it was only natural that he would be able to read her. She just had to make sure that he was convinced of it. As long as he believed she wanted him to dig deeper and nothing more, then that would be the end of it. She no longer had to play the part of a vapid socialite anymore, but she certainly didn't have to reveal her whole hand. Not until the time was right and when she could ensure her own safety and the safety of House Frildarius. For Ingrid's sake. For Glenn's sake. And even Rodrigue's sake, who she could tell had not come fully to terms with the untimely death of his best friend. She would remain Edelgard Eisner for now, until she could reveal her true colors. One layer of her had been unwrapped today, but there was still far more depth to her than Rodrigue could even fathom. And when the time came to reveal her real identity, well, she just had to hope that they would remain by her side. Very well, Edelgard finished, finally setting her empty teacup down. The somber expression on her mood was quickly replaced by a more jovial one in preparation for the long night ahead. It was a conscious switch, but she had already gotten far too used to all the different masks she wore. It was time to play her part. That was a great tea time interrogation, she said with a mock slow clap. Rodrigue looked bewildered, and it was an expression that was absolutely priceless. Now let's go to dinner, shall we? Check the description for the links to the author.